From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
It's a pleasure to welcome you here to the Library of Congress. I am Carolyn Brown. I direct the Office of Scholarly Programs and the John W. Kluge Center here at the library. And before we proceed, the first thing I always request is that you turn off all cell phones and other electronic equipment which can bing and bonk and sing and interrupt the speaker and perhaps also interfere with the recording. This morning's symposium will consider the intellectual legacy of Alfred North Whitehead. It's sponsored by the Manuscript Division of the Library of Congress and the Office of Scholarly Programs, and happens to really coincide with the 150th anniversary of Alfred North Whitehead's birth and the 100th anniversary, more or less, of the publication of Principia Mathematica, written with Bertrand Russell. The particular occasion and motivation for the symposium, however, lies in the very generous donation to the Manuscript Division of a very rare 1936 letter by Alfred North Whitehead to his colleague and research assistant, Henry Leonard. And this letter, which you have an opportunity to see in the back of the room, was donated to the library by Dr. Leonard's son, who's here with us this morning, and we'll hear from him in a moment. Let me say a few words about the Kluge Center and the Manuscript Division. The Kluge Center was established through a generous donation of John W. Kluge in the year 2000, and was given with the intent of bringing together the world's best thinkers and the doers, the scholars and the legislators and other public officials. The idea was that the legislators, the doers, need access to some of the very best thought being generated. The center supports the world's most accomplished senior scholars and most promising rising junior fellows. We also promote small conferences and lectures such as this one. For those of you who are local, you can sign up for more information about the center, or if you're not local, and our programs. You go on the library's front page on the right-hand side, it'll say Kluge Center, and you can follow the instructions. And I should say, since we're sitting right here, the Kluge Center is literally through those doors, so perhaps later, if you'd like a tour, I can provide that. Our partner in this enterprise, though, and the real heroes of the day, is the Manuscript Division. Manuscript Division is the home of this very rare letter, which joins a distinguished collection of 11,000 individual collections of papers that document all aspects of American history and culture. These include not only the papers of many U.S. presidents, cabinet secretaries, members of the Supreme Court, but also some of the nation's greatest manuscript treasures, such as Jefferson's rough draft of the Declaration of Independence, which is a wonder to behold. Every student who's writing should see the drafts with the lines crossed out and the letters and whatnot. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, the paper tape of the first telegraphic message, and Alexander Graham Bell's first drawing for the telephone, and lots of other treasures as well. So we're really honored and privileged to have been chosen as the recipients of this rare letter. We invite everyone to take a look at it, and the book in the Principia Mathematica, a copy signed by Bertrand Russell, and there are copies of the letter and transcripts available. I want to thank particularly the Manuscript Division for their excellent work making the symposium possible. First to Jim Hudson, who was very disappointed that he couldn't be here. He was really the cause of this, we might say, when he heard about the letter. He said, you know, people don't know enough about Whitehead. We ought to do a lecture or a symposium or something. Also, I would like to thank Karen Stewart, who's over there in the back, a very special and valuable technical assistant in the manuscript division. And you'll notice the books are never left alone, or the letters are left alone. She's part of the guard here. And then especially to Len Bruno, who many of you have met in the back, who is the manuscript specialist for science and technology, who attended to every detail of this event. The fact that things are so well prepared and that you have handouts, et cetera, is thanks to Len. I hope you picked up bios of the speakers. That we have a lot crammed in this morning, so I'm not going to do the usual introductions. I think you can just read these. I told all the speakers that I would try to be generous in my introduction, and then I would turn into a tyrant, because I am going to keep people on time with my little warning minutes, 3 minutes, 1 minute left. And I don't think I'll have the nerve to use this, but I have been in conferences where people use an egg timer to keep people on track. I don't think I'll do that, but we'll see. Let me say something then more about the structure. When we get to the 10-minute mark, I will, or whatever the time is, because our keynote has 40 minutes, I will stand up, and it may seem crude. My mother would probably think it was rude, but anyway, we do need to sort of stay on more or less on track. And then the questions, as you'll see, will follow the block of speakers. The restrooms, this is a wonderful building, but things can be hard to find. The men's room is down the corridor and one flight down. For the ladies, you can go down the corridor, across the Great Hall. Behind the giant Bible of Manse, there's like a secret entrance to the ladies' room. But you'll see it when you get close. We'll take a break at 10:30, resume promptly at 10:45, so I'll be out trying to round people up to be sure you're back here. And because the second panel is in 2 stages, when the first 3 speakers finish, I'll ask the others to just get up and switch places. I think that's all for the preliminaries. I've been even a little bit less than my 10 minutes, so that's great. We've saved a little time here. I do at this point want to ask you to welcome Dr. Henry Leonard Jr. to talk about his father and the Whitehead connection and how the letter came to be at the library. So please, Henry. You can stay seated or stand, whatever you prefer.
Good morning. It's thrilling to be here in this beautiful room with all you people to tell you a bit about my father, Henry S. Leonard, and Alfred North Whitehead, and the letter from Whitehead. My father was born in West Newton, Massachusetts in 1905 and took all of his degrees at Harvard University, the PhD in 1931. He was awarded the Bowdoin Prize in Philosophy in 1929, one of Harvard's most prestigious awards. During the year 1929-30, he was a traveling fellow from Harvard at the University of Munich in Germany. My parents were married in early October 1929, just before starting the trip. At Harvard, Henry Leonard studied mainly under C.I. Lewis, H.M. Scheffer, and A.N. Whitehead. He taught at Harvard and Rochester during the Depression, and in 1937 he went to Duke University for 12 years. In 1949, he became professor and head of the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University. I think later the title head was changed, but that was, in those days he was head. And there he remained until his sudden death in July 1967. At MSU, he played an important part in the development of the philosophy department and of the university as a whole. He was appointed to one of the first special university professorships in 1961. From 1959 to 1961, Henry Leonard was a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. In 1936, the book Philosophical Essays was published in honor of Alfred North Whitehead. It consisted of essays written by some of his former students, including the essay Logical Positivism and Speculative Philosophy, written by my father. Shortly after the book was published, my father received a 6-page handwritten letter from Whitehead. To quote my father, "The letter opens with appreciative comments on my contribution to the Whitehead Festschrift. But Whitehead uses these comments only as a stepping stone to remarks of a more general import, which perhaps throw some additional light on Whitehead's intellectual stance. It is primarily for this reason that I have decided to publish the letter here." End of quote. My father wrote these words about 1966 as part of a manuscript that was intended to be a collection with commentaries of some of his papers. Unfortunately, the manuscript, while carefully planned and outlined, was left very incomplete by his sudden untimely death. I believe the letter from Whitehead was seldom far from my father's thinking. Apparently, his essay in the Festschrift, his comments about the essay, the letter, and comments about the letter would have constituted the first chapter of his book. My mother wrote a transcript of the letter because some of the handwriting is difficult to read. After my father's death, my mother kept the letter in her safe deposit box at her bank. When she died in 1980, it became my responsibility to place the letter, the Whitehead letter, in a suitable repository. In May 2009, Ronald Phipps learned of my email address, and have become good friends. He had been my father's personal teaching and research assistant from 1961 until 1967. Soon after Phipps contacted me, I sent him a copy of Whitehead's letter and some related papers. As one thing led to another, the Library of Congress expressed an interest in the letter. It became joyfully clear to me that here was a wonderful opportunity to preserve the letter and to make it available to interested scholars and to the public. I am privileged to be here to participate in this meeting to celebrate Whitehead and my father's association with him. It is indeed gratifying to know that my father's work and his relationship to Whitehead are important to scholars. I look forward to this morning's talks.
Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Roland Farber, and this is our opportunity, and especially my opportunity, I would say, all of us, to get a good overview of Whitehead's thought and his legacy, to really answer the question, why are we here, and why is this so important? So please welcome Dr. Farber.
Good morning. I want to thank Carolyn Brown for inviting us here to this important event, and I say this for all the participants, if I may, and also her manuscript division for preparing everything for this conference and symposium. So in celebration of Whitehead's 150th birthday, and in conjunction with this appearance and publication of a letter of Whitehead to his assistant that the assistant of the assistant brought back to light, so to say, I was asked to reflect on Whitehead's work and its importance. So please, for the next 40 minutes, sit back, fasten your seatbelts, and relax, or pass out, maybe at a certain point. I will go like within 4 phases. The first phase, it will be like an overview, a kind of a vision. A second one is about Whitehead's work. A third phase will be about the future of Whitehead and importance, the fourth one. So how to approach the phenomenon of Whitehead in 40 minutes. And if you have kind of thought of Whitehead like for 15 years or so, then that's really a problem to get everything back into 40 minutes. How to unfold such a complex work, reaching from mathematics and logics to philosophy and theology, and physics and evolutionary theory in between. Whatever I highlight will be overshadowed by a much greater cloud of oblivion, so I should concede to the impossibility of the impossible and just step down. While pondering this calamity, it appeared to me that the landscape of Whitehead's universe itself structures this impossibility. I call it Whitehead's binocular view of things, a polarity in all things. Not only does it indicate the advantage of more than one perspective, but it suggests that reality is always incurably complex, while turning against our understanding through antagonisms of opposites. My title already hints at such a polarity, 300 years of Whitehead halfway. Is it enough to review the past, the genesis of Whitehead's thought, its influence and currency? As important as it may be, should we not also envision the future, its potency? Whitehead intensely concerned himself with the intellectual reconstruction of the preceding 3 centuries, their inventions and revolutions of thought and social life, while adamantly critiquing their shortcomings and downfalls, especially the newly arrived ideologies of positivism and scientific materialism. Yet Whitehead was also deeply engaged in matters of the future, the latencies of society and structures of thought that would avoid the pitfalls of the past, and instead express the transformative processes his own thinking was meant to initiate. In 1940, he suggested in a conversation with Charles Lindbergh that despite the Great War underway, he believed that over the next 2 or 3 centuries, humanity might be able to work out its problems without undue suffering. Whitehead obviously demonstrates a deep trust in the human ability to always decide anew on a civilized world. And his life's work can be understood to spell out this trust with a virtually unending series of binocular perspectives. From the twin perspectives of mathematics and philosophy, and the rejection of the bifurcation of nature into independent systems of matter and mind, to the covalence of science and religion. From the critique of abstractions, if taken for the concrete, and yet the cherishing of abstractions as motor of the evolutionary process, to an organic philosophy in which both ideas and processes are reconciled. From the rhythms of becoming and perishing to the intersection of fact and value and the meaningful oscillation between the world and God. All oppositions, juxtapositions, and double perspectives move, neither sedated on abstract grounds, nor resting fused in a higher unity. Whitehead found ultimate refuge in this dynamics itself, as it motivates all binaries to coalesce. In forming contrasts, a differentiated, complex, moving cosmos comes alive, neither dissolving into sameness nor breaking apart into mere opposites. No wonder that Whitehead, in his magnum opus Process and Reality, claims the ultimate ground of everything not to be anything we can arrest, being or God, matter or mind, but the creative process itself, graciously groundless. Whitehead may well have been one of the first thinkers to reference creativity in such ultimate metaphysical terms. Yet, this harbors another binocular mystery. If you read Whitehead the first time, and even if you become a specialist, it is puzzling why this philosophy of creativity is enveloped in the most complex conceptual system. We may begin to grasp this paradox by recognizing that its aim is to avoid the tendency to stabilize fluency. Instead of making us kings of reality by mastering fixed abstractions, Its complex conceptual apparatus presents itself as a gift, a method of unthinking, if you will, forcing us always to render the process of, to re-enter the process of thinking again, always anew, to become seekers of new ideas and creators of new realities in the pursuit of the art of life. With creativity as ground and contrasting as method in mind, we can add two further characteristics of Whitehead's binocular perspectivism: mutuality, the mode of togetherness, and the event, the place of its happening. The first, mutuality, appears in endless variation throughout Whitehead's work. In his last public lecture, Immortality, given in 1941, Whitehead, in the strongest and most universal terms possible, summarizes his view in terms of the essential relevance of every factor of the universe for the other. Everything is a contrast of finitude and infinity, involving an indefinite array of perspectives. No finite perspective can ever shake off the essential connection with its infinite background. However, since these mutually contrasting perspectives are in need of a meeting place within the flux of things, Whitehead envisions them to convene in events, momentarily unifications of differences. Becoming from the complex multiplicities they gather, they add themselves to a new multiplicity of perspectives, issuing into novel creative processes that generate the universe. Yes, Whitehead was a pluralist. Yet he filtered his pluralism through concrete events in which past and future, abstract and concrete, flux and permanence find themselves in mutual enjoyment. In the momentary suspension of inherent conflicts, their contrasted opposites avoid the impasse of a motionless coagulation and instead generate a creative passage into the unprecedented. Because of the enjoyment of togetherness, the contrasting perspectives convene in events of experience, and the universe exhibits the convergence of diverse perspectives in the mutual immanence of experiences of events. In these rhythms of synthesis, Whitehead finds a sign of eternal greatness already incarnate in the passage of temporal fact, as he says. Beyond all technicalities, this may explain Whitehead's trust in the future. Diffused through its intricate modes of flux, the world process yet displays an essential rightness of things. While not a means for preservation, it reveals itself as harbinger of the ever-renewed potential to create a world. And since the creation of the world draws on the mutuality of perspectives, it augurs the victory of persuasion over force. It is not dominated by the iron necessity of a harmonic of logic. Instead, it is vivified, as Whitehead says, by an aesthetic harmonics that stands before it as a living ideal. Its promise is beyond our grasp. It always steers the general flux in its broken progress towards finer, subtler issues. So what does this first sketch of Whitehead's thought reveal, if not a polyglot thinker inviting us to embark on the adventure of a cosmos that in its very texture manifests one vast aesthetic whole? This process even patiently awaits the appearance of human civilization, while refining itself through the intensities of art, ethics, and religion. It also invites investigation into its nature, revealing its mathematical, physical, and metaphysical patterns. But how did Whitehead's universe become? The shortest way to circumscribe the career that created it is to recall its inception at the Trinity College in Cambridge, England, and its summit at Harvard University in Cambridge, New England. While it arose with mathematics in the tradition of Plato, it transmuted into metaphysics in the tradition of Plato. In fact, both mathematics and philosophy were already confluent in Plato, of whom Whitehead henceforth thought that the Western philosophical tradition only adds itself as a series of extended footnotes. But Whitehead was not a Platonist. He admired the depth of Plato's thought and his dialogical method, never fixing on anything. It always uncovers missed alternatives in any crystallization of thought. Depth can never be systematized. Its truth can only be approximated with utmost sensitivity to the vastness of the universe and humility before its never-ceasing becoming. If we are meant to find rhythms in it, mathematical, physical, metaphysical, then it is because of the relation of the cosmic ingredients rather than any prefabricated order simply there to be discovered. We can divide Whitehead's work into three phases, roughly coinciding with the positions he held in Cambridge, in London, and Harvard. Although Whitehead early on already explored many areas, history, philosophy, theology, politics, women's emancipation, education, his professional focus at Cambridge was mathematics, or more precisely, its interface with the physical universe in terms of topology and logics. The major works of this period, such as universal algebra, mathematical concepts of the material world, or the Principia Mathematica, circumscribe his interest to explore the relations between the fundamental units of the physical world and their conceptualization. His quest has a distinctive flavor as it favors expansive concreteness. Reality cannot be reconstructed by mere abstractions, built up from dimensionless points, arrested by exact measurement, or captured in lifeless logical concepts. Instead, since reality is fundamentally relational, becoming connections extend over space and time, and reasoning employs fluent symbolisms rather than fixed formulae. With Whitehead's move to London, the tacit philosophical presuppositions of mathematical, logical, and scientific reasoning become prominent, and a new element appears. By conceptualizing nature from its perception, Whitehead defines his task against the prevailing bifurcation of external and internal reality, without yet addressing the philosophical discussion in Hume, Locke, Descartes, and Kant. He asserts that any knowledge of nature that includes its very perception already undercuts the dualistic isolation of natural objects from human experience. The works of this period, Principles of Natural Knowledge, the Concept of Nature, and the Principle of Relativity, refine Whitehead's earlier proposal that reality is expansive and that measurement is secondary and contingent on the rules of the concrete universe, which in turn are contingent too. His method of extensive abstraction only demonstrates his philosophical agenda of redefining concrete reality as events that, in their interaction, form relatively persistent characters in a web of threads of space-time. He now famously interprets the natural universe by a series of mutually interacting polarities, event and object, expansion and process, abstract persistence and creative passage. This was revolutionary indeed. If the stuff of the world itself consists in pulses of fleeting events, of which objects are reiterations, then scientific and, more broadly, conceptual knowledge are far from capturing nature, as the Tractatus of the early Wittgenstein has made us believe, but it is more a far cry of its creative passage. Its abstractions are but snapshots of a life that, if it were substantialized into merely external particles of matter, invokes the image of a funeral service mourning the ghosts of disappeared souls. Therefore, Whitehead also objects to the philosophical underpinning of Einstein's general relativity, a very tricky issue. Not relativity per se, to be sure. Rather, Whitehead attacks the implication that its topology be bound by the very particles of matter, their mass and gravity, that are mere abstractions from the continuum of events in production of a general geometry. Third phase. This coincides with Whitehead's move to America. Since it is known as a metaphysical phase, one may wonder whether it constitutes a break with the earlier development. All the readers of Whitehead who at the time may have mistaken him for a mere mathematician, logician, or philosopher of science were indeed astounded by his metaphysical turn. They may have expected a different trajectory because of what they believed to be the true potential of Whitehead's work, such as being explorations into logical positivism or analytic philosophy. Or they simply stopped reading Whitehead. From today's perspective, however, we can better understand this conversion as a fairly logical conclusion of Whitehead's earlier thought. With his philosophical reconfigurations in place, creative events, extended events, abstract objects, and the relation between causality and perception, their philosophical synthesis as critique of abstraction seems almost inevitable. The major works of this period, Science and the Modern World, Process and Reality, and Adventures of Ideas, like the Holy Triad, speaks not only to the new metaphysical method they employ and the inherent will to create a comprehensive cosmological system, but they also precisely thereby answer the lingering metaphysical problem inherent in the rise of modern science and philosophy of the previous 300 years. Now Whitehead directly attacks and systematically deconstructs the lingering scientific materialism that was still underpinning the new physics of relativity and was only slowly loosening its grip on the revolutionary concepts of quantum physics. Since this materialism interacted with modern philosophy by isolating human subjectivity from physical reality, its mechanicism also led to the dismissal of value-creating life, leaving us with a meaningless and dull universe. This is, I think, the intellectual problem to which Whitehead's letter to Leonard, that this symposium is gathered to evaluate, reacts. Whitehead's new metaphysics is a grand proposal. A proposal that inverts the hardened oppositions and oppressive abstractions that motivated no less than the wars of the last centuries intellectually and socially. Its new organic paradigm establishes itself as a series of alternatives. Instead of invoking a ground of being, Whitehead posits the immanence of creativity as the driving force of the becoming of the universe. Instead of Descartes' disconnection of extension and mind, or Spinoza's subsumption of the both under a divine substance, Whitehead proposes an open universe comprised of myriads of events in their organizationally diverse nexuses. Instead of adopting Leibniz's view of a pre-existent or pre-established order of this multiplicity in the mind of God, Whitehead delegates order to the interplay of all actualities as their decisions to realize their potentials, even if they were offered by the mind of God. Instead of Plato's system of ideas flowing from an essentialized structure, Whitehead insists on grounding ideas in their relative inherence in the actual process of the cosmos. Against Aristotle's isolated substances, Hume's streams of impressions, and Leibniz's hermeticism of mentality and physicality, Whitehead fuses all spheres in the growing together of physical and creative events. In their momentary synthesis, the whole universe converges, and in their surrender, it effectively releases itself again to a transcendent future beyond itself. These alternatives again affected reversals of the philosophical tradition. While the substantialist scheme of the past was hounded by the division of active form and passive matter, Whitehead reverses this association. Forms, structures, patterns, characters, and laws of nature are not the origin of activity, but sedimentations of the possible. Events of becoming are not the mere realization of given forms, but the harmonization of actualities and their associated possibilities. Potentials, which Whitehead calls eternal objects, are not possible actual realities as yet unrealized or realized in an alternative world, but evocations and invitations for creative actualization. While Kant could not overcome the isolation of subjectivity from physical reality, Whitehead reverses their generative relations. If subjects are effects of real objects from which they gather themselves, they become not only all relative to the reality they gather in their process of concretization or concrescence, but also to a reality beyond themselves in which they affect new syntheses of becoming. In reversing the Western preference of being over becoming, Whitehead upsets also the undisputed primacy of the higher capacities of intellect and consciousness, as inherited by Descartes, Hume, Kant, Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger. With the cosmic primordiality of each event, feeling its actual past and desiring its relative possibilities, intellect and consciousness are only complex modes of their contrasting. This again inverses the status of humanity in the universe. Instead of disconnecting humanity from evolution and nature, Whitehead articulates its ecological cradle. A last observation. In a quartet of books accompanying the metaphysical phase, Religion in the Making, Symbolism, The Function of Reason, and Modes of Thought, Whitehead emerges as a thinker on civilization. He has already made his metaphysical case for the mutuality of fact and value in all cosmic processes without any anthropocentric bias. In these works, however, he demonstrates that the factors driving the development of human existence, aesthetics, symbolism, art, religion, reason, and social organization, emerge from cosmic forces that suggest a civilized universe, as he says. They are the excess of the creative process, but must be refined in order to contribute to the delicate aim Whitehead attributes to the universal process as a whole, the appearance of intensifications and harmonizations within cosmic organizations. Surveying the development of Whitehead's thought over these four phases leads me to a conclusion that it was driven by a polarity, an expansive move towards utmost metaphysical magnitude, and an inversive move toward a humble relativity of all universal insights in the arousal of its aesthetic aim. To estimate Whitehead's importance is an extremely delicate matter for three reasons. First, since the breadth of his vision is a comprehensive reversal of the intellectual sedimentations of the last 300 years, we may not yet have found an access really to its significance. Second, since the depth of his intuition develops considerably over his own lifetime, any appraisal of his work is crucially limited by the perspective from which it starts or the phase in which it is anchored. Third, if Whitehead's universe of thought is itself untimely, it remains in some tension with the orthodoxies it questioned and the prevalent paradigms by which it is scrutinized. While Whitehead undertook the reshaping of the conceptual conditions under which the scientific revolutions of the early 20th century departed from past paradigms, his new philosophical prospect may well be ahead of their limitations. As Whitehead in a prophetic passage in Adventures of Ideas foresees, when one introduces relevant alternatives excluded from physical realization, one may not be appreciated. In other words, when the virus of novelty strikes, an established organism may initiate defensive countermeasures to immunize its old way of life. Consider the cohabitation of mathematics and philosophy in Whitehead's work. Does the metaphysical phase subsume the mathematical, critically resituate it, or even at least partly abandon its earlier preconditions? Does the critique of the scientific, philosophical, and religious traditions isolate it outside their sphere or instigate a new contrast with ignored alternatives? Does its secularized cosmological function of God make Whitehead a dead man walking? Given the magnitude Nietzsche's declaration of the death of God has had on the intellectual climate of the 20th century with its two all-encompassing wars? Or does it harbor a viable alternative whose relevance we have hardly understood yet? And finally, is Whitehead's organic paradigm that finds a place for purpose in all realms of the universe a dream of a lost time, which meaningful science and philosophy must resist? Or is it the stroke of a genius that will be part of any satisfying understanding of the ecocosmic continuum in the future? A certain air of surprise remains in all of his moves, irrespective of the subtle continuity found from a later standpoint. And the harvest remains ambivalent. Was the Principia arguably one of the most impressive works of 20th century mathematics and logic dethroned, or its logocentrism abandoned by Whitehead's own metaphysics, or not? Is Whitehead's alternative relativity theory, although it had some currency at the time of its inception, dead in light of the predictive power of Einstein's version, or is its underlying mereological approach still a future project? Was Whitehead's metaphysical turn the last rearing of a dinosaur helplessly out of sync with the pulse of postmodern times, or is it a subversive spark we have yet to fully grasp? The last judgment has not yet arrived. Whitehead's philosophy also leaves us with a fascinating picture. Husserl and Heidegger taught at the same time as Whitehead was leaving for Harvard. Existentialism and phenomenology attacked metaphysics, as logical positivists like Carnap disavowed Whitehead right when he turned to metaphysics. Wittgenstein, himself a student of Whitehead's colleague Russell, changed the philosophical outlook yet again, just as Whitehead has found his cosmological voice. All sides, it seems, of the philosophical empire took turns in directions counter to Whitehead's intuition, in turn diminishing perceptivity and receptivity for decades. Alternatives with credibility, such as American pragmatism, were marked by James, Dewey, and Bergson rather than Whitehead. Why? Because of the paradoxical nature of his philosophical contrasts. Consider this. Although denigrated as a realm of rationalism or alternatively unbridled fantasy, Whitehead's metaphysics emphasizes empirical endeavor like pragmatism, interpretation like hermeneutics, decision like existentialism, experience like phenomenology, coherence like the analytic tradition, symbolism like language philosophy, yet Whitehead subversively counters them with equally disturbing contrasts. While empirical, his metaphysics remain stubbornly speculative. While hermeneutical, it remains stubbornly systematic. While close to phenomena, it resists the primacy of consciousness. While coherent, it prioritizes life's chaotic character over the limited instrumental usefulness of logics. While deeply engaged with matters of language, it insists on pre-symbolic reality. Nevertheless, these paradoxes may prove vital. Embedding mathematics and logics in the actual life of the cosmos may add an interesting voice to the current discussion of their foundations. Emphasizing topology may hold hidden treasures given the mutual inconsistencies of current physical theories that still await a revolution of understanding. Including aesthetic purpose might prove quite visionary given the current research within life sciences and the ecological imperative of our times. Envisioning a cosmos of infinite rhythmic cycles fits well with current concepts of eternal inflation, but remains attractive because of its impulse towards novelty. Finally, including the sacred may prove superior to both religious fanaticism and irreligious indifference for a future civilization that neglects its spiritual dimension only at its own risk. It is hard to estimate Whitehead's influence, and time forbids name-dropping. I will only allude to some examples with a flavor of the unexpected. Who else would enjoy long walks with Whitehead than Gertrude Stein? Who else would appear in an essay on creativity of Arthur Koestler? Who would write poems on him other than Charles Olson? who could be spoken through the dialogue of both a dragon and a blind priest, as in John Gardiner's Grendel. Whom else could Aldous Huxley have quoted in support of his hopes for a more liberated society? And who would we not expect to appear in the science fiction vision of a future universe of interconnected organisms from Van Vogt's pen? Let me, in the final section, risk a look into the future. Today, Whitehead's voice is alive and it is being heard. His work is being taken up by fellow travelers who themselves are often visionaries, creatively transforming it in their own field or using it to establish connections beyond classical boundaries. Over decades, Whitehead's legacy was persistently upheld by process philosophy and process theology. Yet it was never removed from innovative movements in education, psychology, sociology, economics, and ecology. Its current proliferation in China, in which there have been established around 20 centers for process studies, was foreseen by Joseph Needham in the 1950s, and Whitehead's own suggestion that his philosophy is in many regards more genuine to Indian and Chinese thought. The East-West and North-South dialogue are ingrained in his very outlook. And a fundamentally ecological, instead of a merely logical character of his cosmology is recognized today. Several long-standing initiatives, such as the Center for Process Studies at Claremont, the international Whitehead conferences held in many parts of the world, or the International Process Network facilitate such developments. The recent work of European Whitehead scholars has produced new lines of research, as has the Whitehead Research Project with its international conferences and books, its contemporary Whitehead series, and most recently, by gaining the permission of the Whitehead estate to create the first critical edition of Whitehead's works ever. These initiatives have, again, inspired interest far beyond the sphere of just insiders. Probably the most important event in the newer history of Whitehead's philosophical reception was the untimely and rather unexpected influence of his work on the now famous French philosopher Gilles Deleuze. Not only did he name Process and Reality, one of the most important works in philosophy, but he knighted the universe with James Joyce's term chaosmos. Such a fresh look counters a tradition that has labeled and filed away Whitehead maybe far too early. Even with the arrival of new philosophies such as Bruno Latour's philosophy of cosmic communities, the objective realism of Graham Harman, or Judith Butler's recent, more ecological work, the profound paradigm shift Whitehead initiated is no longer overlooked. Rather, it is recognized as part of the heritage from which they depart. This is a new situation, and indeed, it can be expected to continue to unfold. In looking forward, what makes Whitehead's cosmology attractive today is its vision of the future of humanity and the planet. I will only hint at three perspectives. First, it embraces the very small, the grain of reality, and the very large, an infinite universe with organic processes that initiate all kinds of ecological rhythms at large. This chaosmos comes forth from unimaginable pasts and ventures into unimaginable futures. Gathered from its becoming, we are no strangers to it, but children. Second, pervading the simplest path of empty space and the biophysical organisms building up planets and what they harbor on their crust like fragile foam, Whitehead finds an inherent eros of adventure. Every creature is in its peculiar way responsible for its enactment. What if the majestic laws of nature were neither mechanical devices nor external divine decrees, but communal effects of a myriad of creatures, a matrix of their passionate feeling of causality and novelty? For Whitehead, their passion expresses the presence of an eternal tone that always incarnates itself anew in all events and cosmic epochs. This is a meaningful universe, a meaningful all. Its ecological depth makes us earthbound, yet its spirit opens never-ceasing niches of life in the midst of all the tragedies of its perpetual perishing. Third, in Whitehead's paradigm of experience, all abstract opposites meet to conspire in creative becoming. Instead of seeking a world formula a la, let's say, Stephen Hawking, Whitehead's thought balances all polarities on the pivot of poetics, sharing patterning with mathematics, and also inviting a coordination of depth alongside philosophy, where both mathematics and philosophy may cling to the wonders of their abstractions and what they can reveal, discovering order upon order. Poetics reminds them of the rugged beauty of the multiplicity of experiences upon experiences in which those structures are steeped. For Whitehead, this poetics is divine, and it vivifies, as he says, the good sense which we term civilization. Herein, I suggest, lies the very reason for Whitehead's juxtaposition of positivism and speculative metaphysics, when in his letter to Leonard, he seems distressed, even annoyed by the very inception of positivism, so because of the lack of imagination and a muted sense of depth and future. If reason becomes reduced to an is, and the is to a method of the imitation of a dreamless universe of material particles, we are left with the lifeless logic of their mapping. Conversely, Whitehead ends his last book, Modes of Thought, with a very different imperative. Only a philosophy that is sensitive to depth as yet unspoken will allow us to maintain a social a novelty of fundamental ideas illuminating the social process. No wonder then that trust in metaphysics, however slight, superficial, and incomplete its insights may be, is the one presupposition for Whitehead without which there can be no civilization, because it harbors that which guides its imagination and justifies its purpose. The evil of the future, Whitehead says, is the suppression of aesthetic creativeness. He once confessed that he owes this insight to the vivid life of his wife, Evelyn. This insight that, as Whitehead says, aesthetics is the aim of existence, and kindness, love, and artistic satisfaction are among its modes of attainment, must be considered the very motive of Whitehead's work and the impulse it hopes to release. In his conversation with Charles Lindbergh, Whitehead confirms that in the midst of the most devastating war, that the very force that alone is meant to withstand the violence and destruction and the decline of civilized worlds is gentleness, as it is the very force that slowly and in quietness operates at the heart of the universe. May we nourish it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so very, very much. Before we have questions and answers, we're going to invite another speaker forward, Dr. Abdul Karim Sarouche, who will give us I think I'm going to call it a footnote on the influence of Whitehead in other parts of the world. Dr. Sarouche is a well-known Iranian scholar, and you have his bio.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you for giving me the chance to take you thousands of kilometers from here to Iran and to tell you something about what's going on in Iran nowadays about Whitehead. I tell you my personal story, which is exemplar. I did science before I did philosophy, and when I first encountered with Whitehead was with the Harvard Whitehead, rather than the London Whitehead, as Mr. Foma actually mentioned. Whitehead made his way into Iran through his book, Adventures and Ideas. And that was the first book by him, well-known and then translated with some very heavy footnotes by one of the clerics in Iran. And I mention especially clerics because he was liked and admired by clerics because of his religious philosophy and because of the divine spirituality which you can find in his writings. I remember that especially I liked, and others also liked, the phrase, the remark by Whitehead in Adventures and Ideas, that in the modern time, professors have replaced prophets. So this dichotomy, or perhaps the contrast between prophets and professors, was very illuminating of the idea and the thought of Whitehead, and also mentions and explains why he was so admired by some of members of the clerical establishment and also some of the general readers. No, that was perhaps my first encounter. Then when I did some philosophy of science, of course, I came to appreciate much more Whitehead, especially when I did read his theory of relativity and his perhaps criticism of Einstein, and of course his anti-Wittgenstein stand, his anti-positivism stands, and all these things were quite telling and worth reading and contemplating. Now, I am one of the translators of Whitehead in Iran into Persian. I would say one of rare translators, because actually there are only two people who have translated Whitehead. One of them is this modest gentleman here, and the other one is no longer in the world, and so he lives with his God. Now, I came across his book, Science in the Modern World. I liked it because at that time I was doing my philosophy of science, and so Whitehead did give me some very creative and imaginative ideas about science, especially what he said about the current materialism in science. And especially I liked, again, his, let us say, discovery, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which I had a hard time translating it into Persian. And I mean, eventually I came across a very apt, I think, phrase in order to render it into Persian. And now it is, I am glad that it is in wide use. And now everybody understands what he meant by the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And this is the fallacy which is always committed by materialist scientists who misplace the concreteness and who do not know where the concreteness lies and resides. So that was, and then I translated one of the chapters of the Science in the Modern World, and that was the last chapter of the book under the title Science and Religion. Actually, I included this chapter in one of my books, which has got the same title, actually, Science and Religion. So I thought that it was most relevant to include that. It was, again, a very, good and I would say educating addition to my book, because there actually he mentioned that the conflict of science and religion is not a threat, but a chance. So we have to, appreciate it and to work on it, and perhaps to forge a real relationship and connection friendly connection between science and religion, where science gives you the small picture, religion gives you the grand picture of the universe. And through this, you can come perhaps to the conclusion where to locate science within religion or side by side religion. That was a very good vision by Mr. Whitehead, which I used it and found it quite interesting and useful. Then, of course, I did not forsake Whitehead, so I continued. And when I was in London, I came across a very good book written by an American, Ian Barber. Perhaps some of you might know him. He is a man who works, and his main expertise, of course, is a physicist, but his main expertise is on the relationship between science and religion. He has produced volumes upon volumes on the same subject, and he shows that it's quite familiar with the ideas in philosophy of science and, of course, in science and so on. One of his earlier books is Issues in Science and Religion. That I took it with me to Iran. That was in 1980, roughly, yes, 1980. And I found a very good translator. And the book was translated into Persian, one of the best translations. A very good chapter on Whitehead you can find in this book under the title of Process Philosophy or Process Spirituality, something. So there you find, a very good exposition of the process philosophy of Whitehead, together with the ideas of Ian Barber and some Whiteheadians, of course, here in America. So that was a very good introduction, much better than the previous works on Whitehead in Iran. And I think now through this book, people come to realize and to appreciate more and more the ideas of Whitehead. Again, I did some other things, and that was when I, again, found the book by Arthur Burt, one of the professors on history of philosophy in Colorado University. The book is written in 1930s. And the author is a rather obscure one, but the book is one of the classics on the history of philosophy of science. The book's title is Metaphysical Foundations of Modern Science. There, actually, he mentions Whitehead in actually two different contexts. In the first context is that the Whitehead does not take history of science seriously. And because of that, there are flaws in his philosophy when he speaks about science. And then he goes on, and of course, after a while, he corrects himself and says, now Mr. Whitehead is taking history of science into account, and that makes his philosophy more complete and more serious, according to him. Because Arthur Burt, actually, he thinks that Newton is the Aristotle of the modern time. And so unless you know and you understand Newton and his place in history of science, you will not be able to understand neither the modern science nor the modern philosophy. Therefore, in order to understand it, you have to go deeply in the history of science. And he thinks that Whitehead's philosophy is a philosophy which is blind to history. And being blind to history is a deep, deep flaw and shortcoming, and which is quite right. And then, as I said, he said that now Whitehead is coming to realize and to understand the value of history, and then his philosophy is becoming better and better. Actually, that was the last thing I did on Whitehead, translating the book by Arthur Burt, and on the process philosophy. But I must admit, these are my last remarks, that I found Whitehead a very hard thinker, and especially his language is impenetrable. If you, read his Gifford lectures, is virtually incomprehensible. I personally cannot, make much from what he says. His Adventures of Ideas is for the general reader. His Science in the Modern World is for the general reader, let alone his Principia Mathematica and so on, which no longer nobody, I think, reads it except the historians of logic, historians of mathematics. And I would say that Bertrand Russell, the co-author of the Principia Mathematica, is much, much more in vogue in Iran and in whole Islamic world, not because of his important ideas, but because of his heretical ideas. And his heresies are so dear to the heart of the Muslims and the religious people who would like to see the ideas of others, of the outsiders, let us say, and especially the let us say, irritating language of Bertrand Russell when he speaks about religion, about God, about why he was not a Christian, and so on and so forth. So his books makes it, a better reading than Whitehead, who is so concise, and even you see in the letter he has written to Leonard that, he makes use of expressions and remarks which you have to have a deep knowledge of his philosophy in order to understand what he says in such a short letter. So may God bless his soul, and God bless you, and thank you all. Thank you for everything.
The floor is open for questions and comments. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, I should have asked you to wait for the microphone. Oh, okay. We have multiple helpers now. Over here.
Oh, here, you take.
Oh, here, yeah.
My question is for you you made a passing remark about Whitehead and Einstein. I'm just asking for an elaboration of Whitehead's critique of Einstein.
Well, is that working or? Pardon? It comes? Okay. So, I guess basically, Whitehead was very much concerned with relativity theory and early quantum physics, and this is still a matter of research, how far that really goes, whether he left off later on or not on that matter. But so he was always there was almost this differentiation between the kind of scientific approach or the formalization of things and the philosophical conditions under which they are done. And his kind of criticism was that his criticism of history, and I'm in this sense do not agree that, I don't know at which point Whitehead was not interested in history. He was meticulously interested in history, at least in his later works. They are all historical,
Later books, that's right.
working through history in this sense. If that was the context, yeah. That the revolutions of modern science, and in particular relativity theory, were kind of overcoming the early philosophical conditions of Newton and other ones under which they have formulated the understanding of the cosmos, right? As the basic concepts of matter particles and other things, how the universe works together and how it can be abstracted in mathematical formula and so on. And he found that modern science was actually giving us a way for philosophy to catch up, so to say, in a certain way, if we could at the same time also criticize the conditions under which itself still was bound to the old philosophical concepts. So there was something new, but it was still underpinned by old philosophical concepts. And I guess this was more or less the point where he criticized Whitehead's relativity theory to be still in a certain with preconditions which are not fitting the new situation that it actually opens up, the relativity that it opens actually up. So in concrete, I mean, there are a lot of discussions around how that is actually working out. His formula he came up with on relativity was quite similar. And there were early tests that kind of seem to say the classical tests are passing, so it's like this, it gets to the same expressions, but he wants to say I can make it much more easier. The formula is actually easier. It makes a more concrete way to articulate what Einstein made complicated with his mathematics. And later on, there were other tests which show that there are actually not, certain tests would not be passed, more modern tests would not be passed between after the classical tests were passed, and so on. So there's a kind of division whether, in what sense Whitehead's formula actually mathematically and physically can be tested and holds up. And this is I would say, on the one hand, a close discussion, but on the other hand, we do find restatements of that. Now, the one or two of the basic kind of visions that Whitehead had, why he thought that was complicated or problematic in Einstein, was that he thought that of the mathematics that formulates itself from mathematical points is actually already an abstraction of a concrete universe that's always extended. And this extension produces a geometry that is, so to say, in a cosmos, in a cosmos, because he knows there could be different cosmic epochs or different universes, formulates a very basic geometry. And how can it be that particles of matter with their mass and so on can curve space-time, so the geometry, if the geometry is more basic than these particles of matter? This was one of the unsolved problems that he saw, that the abstract can actually create the concrete. That's his basic problem, so to say.
Hello. So in these wonderful presentations, we've heard a couple of examples from each of the speakers, one by Professor Faber about China and new centers of process studies there, and Professor Sarouche of the Iranian connection. So there are these possible bridges between cultures, or examples of them. I'd like perhaps each of the speakers to comment on the potential of Whiteheadian thought for such bridges between cultures.
As far as I can gather, I mean, Whitehead also, although was somehow influential in the past, before the Islamic Revolution in Iran, after the revolution, I think he has fallen into oblivion, if you like. Although, as I said, some clerics are more interested in his works, some of the religious people, rather than scientists. So among scientists, perhaps he doesn't have a reputation, or rather a good reputation. And even when you do philosophy of logic, seldom I have heard anybody mention the name of Whitehead and his contribution to Principia Mathematica. And Frege, for example, is in vogue and is in a very good reputation, and even sometimes Bertrand Russell. And most of his books are translated into Persian, the heretical ones, the scientistic ones, the philosophical ones, and so on. But Whitehead, apart from the bits and pieces I mentioned here, is no longer there. Actually, before this, I mentioned to Caroline that these meetings now encourages me to suggest to some of my Iranian colleagues perhaps to hold a seminar on Whitehead, and perhaps to bring to the attention of especially the students who do not know much of him, to have an idea and perhaps to go back to his books. And now that I hear the good news that the whole series of his work is being re-edited, So, and this makes available his thoughts. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find any traces of Whitehead in the Islamic world worldwide. I am not sure how much and how he has been received by other Muslim countries, and how much his philosophy has been influential among others. Perhaps that might be a subject of another study, which I have to do, and perhaps I report it in a next meeting here or elsewhere. But his understanding of God, which is an evolving God, which flies into the face of the traditional God, which is not an evolving God, which is a constant God, a fixed God, if you like, a God which does not change, a God which is absolutely perfect, and there is no more perfection to be gained by God. So this is a matter of concern for Muslims, for perhaps Christians, for Jews, and so on. So his divinity is a special divinity, and reconciling his divine with the Islamic divine or with Christian divine is a little bit different and difficult. And Mr. Ian Barber, who tried to, invoke the Whiteheadian God, has taken, a very difficult job, and that is out of the necessity of bringing in science, and in order to have science and evolution together with God, so he could not do with a constant God. Therefore, he actually had to bring in a God which is evolving all the time and does not have all perfections at hand. So he is now making himself more perfect. So this is as far as I can say.
There's a Pakistani, very famous philosopher, but Akbar, who was kind of
A little
more Hawthorne than Whitehead.
more under Bergson influence than Whitehead. But yes, he mentions Whitehead.
I do have some Islamic students, and we have some, especially from Turkey, who are trying to engage with Whitehead, even in his theological thinking in relation to Islam, actually. So where probably there is a connection for them is that it is quite easy from a Sufi-influenced metaphysics to talk about the becoming universe. That is the connection, less than the God problem. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So I guess really one of the basic problems is the question of reading Whitehead for how they make an impact in a certain culture or not. You see, as originally and with my mother tongue speaking German, I should say to read Hegel and Kant should be easier for me than for you to do it in English, but I can tell you to read them in English is easier than to read them in German. So sometimes maybe the translations are helping to reduce the heavy load. It's a filter, right? So it's even easier maybe to read them in other languages at first, right? If you get to the original text, then they become extremely complicated because all the feelings of what that language means and how they formulate that, bring concepts together is much more complicated. So mostly it begins with the translation of Whitehead somewhere. And it's interesting that there are still ongoing translation projects. So we have at least 2 sets of translations in China, and every translator says about the other he has a bad translation, which is good. So you get differences and read all of them, kind of. We do have especially a resurgence, if you want, through translations in Eastern Europe. In Poland, in Hungary for maybe 10 or 15 years already, and Romania and other countries, which is quite interesting. There was a long tradition of Whitehead, and the texts were always available in the German-speaking world, and so there was a thoroughgoing tradition from the late 50s in philosophy with a small group that was present all the time. So there was an established Whitehead tradition that's different from the American one. It was not influenced by Hawthornian thinking, for instance, or free of it, kind of thing. And that is, again, coming back today with, I think, major interest. So Whitehead was included also in conferences in Berlin, for instance, several years ago on creativity. There was not related to Whitehead at all, but they thought, Whitehead creativity, that's an important thing. So there is a kind of virus. It is different in French language. It was a long, long time that Whitehead was not translated in France, so people had to read it in the original, and I can imagine Gilles Deleuze reading it in English, and then he didn't probably like to do so, because it was not present. So it's still ongoing that you get all the texts there. So today, this is the most lively, I guess, in Europe is the French-speaking area right now. But in Spanish today, or even in Portuguese, you find virtually nothing, and it's kind of it's gone in a sense. There were translations. The same is then true for Southern America. It has to be reinvigorated by translators, right? So they have to either republish all translations or become translators again, or they like English, right? It's the easiest way to get to it. As in certain areas of Africa, Central Africa, where Whitehead is present in universities, where they read English and not French, for instance, right, or speak in this sense. I think one of to mention China again, the more interesting thing is not science, Whitehead and science, but it's Whitehead and education. So he kind of has taken over certain educational issues since its early days in Cambridge. Especially, for instance, if you think women's education, that they get the same rights at the university, was really a problem. He was sitting up on such panels, fighting for that, and he was mentioning that it was not only once that he got oranges and eggs thrown at him for things like this. So he had a political stance, and education became important in London, where he took over a post as a dean, and was engaged in education for London, the Greater London, and so on, and wrote about education a lot. And so China kind of asks today questions of how can we situate for a new ecological future. And Whitehead comes to mind and has a certain currency right there. And they come here too. So to Claremont, for instance, in regular conferences, public officials of states or the government to kind of learn something about that. So there is an interesting kind of, it's neither philosophical or theological, it's nor scientific, but it's more about how do we figure out a new ecological civilization.
Seeing no immediate questions, I'm going to ask a question of my own. It has always seemed to me that Chinese civilization from its earliest periods, and I'm thinking, I guess, especially of Taoism, not the Confucian strand, but the Taoist strand, has premised becoming as opposed to being. And if you just think of the very familiar Taoist notion of yin-yang and turning into one another. It's a little different from what you're talking about, but there's a fundamental notion of becoming as primary. And I think when you get to Neo-Confucianism, which then begins to figure out how to incorporate the Taoist perspective and then the impact of Buddhism, that notion of becoming is extended into the human realm, I think. You can tell me if I've got this right. But I was guessing from that, and then another little small connection. It's my understanding that some of the Chinese thinking about process as fundamental entered into Europe through Leibniz, coming from Jesuits in Beijing. So I'm wondering, even though, as you said, in China the interest in Whitehead seems to be focused in the arenas of education and ecological understanding of the world if there isn't a fundamental compatibility that's built into the very maybe unspoken premises of at least strong strands of Chinese thinking, and what you make of that. Or does anyone make anything of it?
Well,
oh, good.
shall I say, I mean, just a few things. You know, there is a very well-known philosopher in Iran whose name is Shirazi, and he lived in about 400 years ago under this, in the Safavid period. And he is, I mean, by far perhaps the most prominent philosopher in Iran and perhaps in all Islamic world compared to Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and others. Now, one of his main, perhaps, discoveries in philosophy, I have written a whole book on this particular discovery, is the philosophy of substantial change. And, you know, my book title is The Restless Nature of Universe. So this actually tells you a lot about the nature and the spirit of his philosophy, the restless nature of universe. There actually he mentions, I mean, you know, and he argues, you know, in metaphysical and philosophical terms about the restless nature and the becoming, which is inherent in being. So from that point of view, it makes it somehow, you know, a cousin of Chinese philosophy, and to some extent, you know, I think is close to Whiteheadian process philosophy. Although Whitehead did not perhaps like his metaphysics, I mean metaphysics of Shirazi, because his metaphysics is very Aristotelian rather than Platonic. And as Mr. Faber actually mentioned, he was fond of Plato. I mean, Mr. Whitehead.
Right, Ron. Yeah, would you wait for the mic? Here comes Kiyoya with the mic.
Thank you. I'd like to make a little comment in respect to Carolyn's question. The Chinese, I could tell you right now, are translating Professor Chen Gong from the major University of Science and Technology is translating this letter from Whitehead to Professor Leonard's father, and their publications will occur. I spoke about this letter in a seminar in November that went into theoretical physics, not just theory of education or ecology. I also have some friends from the Chinese Academy of Particle Physics, high-energy physicists and low-energy physicists who worked at Brookhaven, who worked in Brookhaven National Laboratory, who worked in MIT with Professor Ding, Nobel Prize winning particle physicist, and also spent a decade in CERN. The interesting thing when I described the implications of Whitehead's philosophy to theoretical physics and particle physics, I remember Professor Year saying, this is exactly the way I've been thinking. So the resonance of Whitehead's thought to traditional modes of Chinese thinking, and especially, as you correctly say, Carolyn, Taoism, with its sense of integration, vacuumlessness, is a kinship that's felt in theoretical physics. And the Center for, the International Center for Process Science, Philosophy, and Education, we have members who are Chinese physicists. And so I think this point that you make is very valid. It comes from Whitehead's own intuition, but it's extending into the realm of pure science and, I believe, cosmology as well as ontology.
Yeah. Second part of the morning's program is to, I think you're in the middle there, to have several scholars reflect on different aspects of Whitehead's thought and legacy, to take the conversation a little deeper in certain particular areas, both scholarly and in some cases personal. And each speaker will speak for 10 minutes, then the second three will come forward. There wasn't enough room to have everybody up here all at the same time. And then we will do questions and answers after that. And I do want to thank our two photographers, Jim Piper, a secret Whitehead scholar I didn't know about till recently, and then Abby Brack from the Public Affairs Office. So, my first, I didn't bring my crib sheet, but the first speaker knows who he is, so if you would, George, okay.
Good morning. All right, I'll do this from the podium. Thanks. Put a watch where I can see it so I don't go over. Carolyn made it very clear that we would be dispatched summarily in good military fashion, pushed off the seawall, hung from the yardarms, or shot to death if we went over our 10 minutes. I'm supposed to speak on Whitehead and Wittgenstein, and I really want to offer a few informal comments that are really mostly personal. It says something there also about ethics, and I won't say anything about ethics. That's my vocation now. I teach ethics. I have a chair in what's called the Stockdale Center at the Naval Academy, as well as ethics and public policy at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. And I mention that only because, sadly, the opportunity to talk about Whitehead, think about process philosophy, is more of an avocation in those situations than a vocation. And so it's a great privilege even to be included in this very distinguished group at this very special occasion. And I'll try not to rain on the parade. I don't want you to think that Carolyn and Tim have ended up inviting the Grinch or Eeyore to come and speak. But after the beautiful, eloquent opening address by Roland Faber on Whitehead's importance, his significance, the discussion of him as a cultural bridge, connecting not only cultures but different faiths. I tend, where others are exuberant about these things, to be melancholy. And when others look at the tremendous influence that Whitehead has, I lament in good Eeyorian fashion the decline and disappearance of Whitehead among the communities of scholars in whom he was most interested and engaged himself. Of that decline, I'd cite two disturbing examples that I deeply regret and indeed resent very much. First, there's only one graduate program, PhD program in philosophy left in the country where someone can go and study Whitehead. That is a PhD philosophy program. And that is due to the presence of my former graduate student, Judith Jones, at Fordham University, itself a shadow of its former self. And it was there at Fordham that she herself mentored a student, a young colleague, Brian Henning, who together with Roland, their efforts have brought about this Whitehead research project and the collected edition of Whitehead's works that Roland mentioned towards the end of his talk. And that's wonderful, but that's not enough. It's hardly the critical mass we need. And when you look at the other great programs from the past, Harvard, Yale, Emory, Chicago, Texas, they no longer have Whitehead scholars, nor do they have any intentions, as far as I know, to replace them. Even more poignant for me, working as I do with naval personnel who are deeply enamored of the legacy of Vice Admiral James B. Stockdale, the Navy's main philosopher. Where are the Phil Rhinelanders? Phil Rhinelander was a very eminent interpreter of Whitehead at Stanford University. He was also dean of the graduate program, graduate studies there, and it was he who mentored the young Lieutenant Commander Stockdale when he came to take his degree in international relations and ended up doing independent studies in philosophy with Phil Rhinelander. Where are we going to get people like that now who have such a tremendous influence far outside the fields of philosophy alone? So I tend, in my old age, to look at these things and lament them rather than celebrate them and wonder, what will become of us. Another example, some years ago, I did an accreditation site visit from a Department of Education licensed accrediting institution to the University of London's external program, itself a very eminent program. Nelson Mandela got his degree while in prison in South Africa, got a law degree from the external program at the University of London. Mohandas Gandhi is an alumnus, or was an alumnus. It's a pretty good program, and it has this interesting legacy of bringing together all the campuses of the University of London, who otherwise have very little to do with one another, are deeply proud of their own traditions and disdainful of their colleagues in the other campuses. As I said in my report to the department, the University of London is a whole which is considerably less than the sum of its parts. One of those very eminent parts, along with the London School of Economics and Jeremy Bentham's University College, is the Imperial College of Science and Technology. And indeed, I took this task on, kind of thankless accreditation task, because it would give me a chance to go to this place that Whitehead served as dean for most of the useful years of his career. Most of what would have been the sort of most productive years in any ordinary person's career were spent as their first dean, taking what had been really founded to serve as a grimy, grubby, urban polytechnic institute to teach vocational studies to the lesser classes, and lifting it up to that vision of education that we find so eloquently portrayed in his essay on the aims of education much later. That vision of liberal education that transforms the vocations from merely the grimy, grubby pursuit of technique into ennobling professions in their own right. We know from the letters that we did have, the few from Whitehead during this time, that this was a very difficult task for him. And it took a lot of energy and time, burdensome administrative duties, while trying to carry on a useful program of scholarship, some of the highlights of which, again, Professor Faber mentioned in his eloquent address. But those all came at a terrible personal price, and it was for that reason that Whitehead was so eager, essentially, to shake the dust from his feet and turn his back on his native land at the relatively advanced age of 63, I say, as I approach that age myself, and leave his native land and come to the United States and accept this position at Harvard, which at last gave him the opportunity to indulge in his scholarly interest unfettered by the crushing administrative burdens that he had faced at the Imperial College. Well, that piece of the history is probably well known to you, though perhaps not portrayed in so grim a fashion as I just have. What I think is disappointing is to go back there and find there is no portrait, there is no bust, there is no sense of the legacy of this man who built the college into one of the premier scientific and technological institutions in the world today. I think Whitehead deserves a great deal of credit for that, but no credit, to my knowledge, is given to him in his native land or in this place. There's a library dedicated to his friend, Lord Haldane, in which some of Whitehead's books are to be found, but there is no, at least I was unable to find in my visit there, any mention of the history of the school that mentioned Alfred North Whitehead and his pioneering work to build it into the institution it is today. Well, I could go on, and I can't go on, or Carolyn's going to do me in. I was supposed to talk about Wittgenstein and the donation of this letter and Professor Henry's own comments about his father's work on Whitehead and logical positivism. I remember looking at that when I was interested in Wittgenstein and logical positivism myself, and I'm embarrassed to say I can't remember the thrust and the details of the paper, and I had no idea who it was or who I was reading. It was just some other author who had thought deeply about these questions. But I think I recall either the phrase or at least the thought that this relentlessly narrow and destructive dialectic of logical positivism would end up obscuring the very real and important areas of common interest, problems of common concern that Whitehead shared with his predecessors and colleagues in that field, including Wittgenstein, and would end up marginalizing the broader and more profound interests of Whitehead, the philosopher. And I fear that's exactly what's come to pass. In my own work on Whitehead and Wittgenstein subsequently, in a Wittgenstein Congress outside of Vienna in 1994, I was invited only because I had written on Whitehead, Hegel, analytic philosophy, and the history of process thought in ways that seemed useful to the conference organizers, Jaakko Hintikka and others, who were interested in Wittgenstein and the legacy of 20th century British philosophy. Well, I pointed out there that Whitehead's Process and Reality in particular had appeared at a time roughly equivalent to the appearance of Being and Time and Wittgenstein's Tractatus. So we had Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and Whitehead, all sort of a triumvirate. I didn't include Husserl, as Professor Farber did today. I still haven't made up my mind where he belongs in this, but it was a useful triumvirate because the other two, one representing continental thinking, the other British analytic tradition, even though carried out by an Austrian engineer, had turned their backs on the sort of thing that Whitehead was doing. And so it was interesting to consider whether theirs was the harbinger of the age and the future, or whether this legacy that Whitehead represented of the grand tradition of philosophical speculative thought would emerge one day again as carrying that tradition forward for the future. The other historical observation I made, since there was very little to work with, other than the fact that Wittgenstein had dinner at the Whiteheads a couple of times, and certainly commented on the Principia from time to time, he really didn't have much to do with or have much in the way of influence of Whitehead. So what was one to do at a conference like this? Well, talk about what had happened subsequently to Wittgenstein, as well as to Russell and Moore, alongside Whitehead. All four of them were the great founding figures of what came to be known as the 20th century tradition of analytic philosophy. And interestingly enough, that was a tradition that in the subtitle of my talk, which was the critique of enlightenment and the question concerning metaphysics, that was an enlightenment project. It carried on that grand tradition of looking for perfection and progress in the form in the 20th century of looking for precision, exactness, and lack of ambiguity. Think not only of the Tractatus, but also of the search for protocol language and the Principia itself. All of these were projects designed to try and delve and plumb the depths of things and bring an analytic rigor to them that heretofore had been lacking, and remove questions of ambiguity and unclarity. And all of those thinkers in various ways turned their backs on that project over the course of their careers. Wittgenstein followed Moore, retreating into the ambiguities of ordinary language, and turned his back on the project of the Tractatus. Whitehead, of course, we know, attributed most of that work, I think, falsely to Russell, but he himself later said the exactness of logic is a fake, and it is more interesting that it is more important that a proposition be interesting than that it be true. And it's very hard to understand the utterances of a person who had the kind of background Whitehead had and influence he had, unless one sees all of these figures as subsequently, as they did. Russell, the last of them. It took him until the 1940s before he gave up on his project. And his anger at Wittgenstein is well known over this. Mr. Wittgenstein has come to think that the utterances of everyone are meaningful except philosophers, was one of his famous quotes in denouncing the later Wittgenstein's work with language. And yet one wonders, why did they do that? What was it that led them back? led, I think, by Whitehead in the end, and at the very tail end, Russell, who finally turns to a kind of, having made fun of James as well, William James most of his life, a Jamesian neutral monism as a metaphysical position that he thinks most in keeping with that picture of the world that Whitehead was trying to sketch so difficultly and at such difficulty in process and reality. Russell himself comes to that view, and but only much later. I think there's something to be said for understanding the continuity and the conversation that Whitehead was involved in and carried on with his colleagues and contemporaries, and the way in which that conversation evolved, if we were to understand what are otherwise lamentably obscure works like Process Reality, and understand what the project was that Whitehead was trying to carry out, to give a sketch, a picture, in this famous distinction that Wittgenstein makes between what can be said and what can only be shown, to show in words what can only be shown in Process and Reality, what the world must be like, what the entities in that world must be like if all we know from our understanding of relativity physics, quantum mechanics, and evolution are true. I think it's a brilliant achievement, and we haven't fully understood yet or grasped its significance, and I hope the day will come when we do. Thank you.
I just noticed that in my attempt to oppose being on a flexible universe, I've mixed up the panel members a little bit, and we're in the wrong order, but why don't we proceed and just know that the flux of the universe has had the last laugh. So Derek.
Well, I have a couple of pieces of good news for George that may lift his spirits. There is a new PhD program in process thought at the Claremont School of Theology, PhD in process thought. So that's happy. And I actually participated in October in a symposium at the University of Chicago on process political theory. So some green shoots, perhaps. I've been asked to speak about the relationship between Whitehead's thought and that of the great Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant. And this topic seems to me to be especially appropriate in relation to the Leonard letter, because the problematic intellectual negations of logical positivism have as one of their key intellectual antecedents Kant's central theoretic notion of the noumenon, that is, the concept of the unknowable, which Kant associates with the objects of traditional metaphysical analysis. Yet for Kant, this is a negation that is made as a gesture of humility, epistemic humility, whereas, as Whitehead indicates in the Leonard letter, the logical positivists come eventually to wield this negation as an arrogant dismissal of all other approaches to philosophy and the analysis of human experience. Wittgenstein annoys me intensely too, I have to say. Moreover, Whitehead viewed logical positivism's rejection of metaphysical inquiry as a covert form of anti-rationalism, insofar as it entails a denial of inescapable practical presuppositions of human experience. And it is worth noting that Whitehead's insistence that philosophy takes seriously such inescapable practical presuppositions aligns, in a way, with Kant's use of practical reason. Yet Kant employs this notion of that which we inevitably and inescapably presuppose in our living as a way around his own prohibition against inquiry into the true nature of things, and thereby introduces an irrationalism into his own theory, a tension, in fact, between the theoretical and the practical. Whereas Whitehead seeks to resolve such tension by using the criterion of practical necessity to cleanse philosophy of those abstractions and sensibilities that had grown up over the preceding 300 years, that had divorced intellectual analysis from intuition and feeling. Whitehead, I believe, considered Kant one of his most important historical interlocutors. At the end of the chapter in Process and Reality titled From Descartes to Kant, Whitehead invokes Kant's recognition of the relationship between the epistemic constitution, the constitution as a knower and a believer, and as an experiencer, right, more fundamentally for Whitehead. The epistemic constitution of the subject and the ordering of the external world in a deeply appreciative way, in summing up the trajectory of thought that culminates in Kant's transcendental idealism and framing Whitehead's own crucial discussion of what he calls the subjectivist principle in the following chapter, Whitehead writes, "We have now come to Kant, the great philosopher who first fully and explicitly introduced into philosophy the conception of an active experience as constructive functioning, transforming subjectivity into objectivity and objectivity into subjectivity. The order is immaterial in comparison with the general idea," end quote. Of course, Kant presupposes, and by the way, I should say, forgive me, in 10 minutes to say anything about two figures as dense and obscure as Kant and Whitehead is difficult. I may be dense and obscure myself a bit in the next paragraph or so, but I'll unpack it later if you ask questions. Kant presupposes the long-standing Aristotelian ontology of enduring substances in his account of subjectivity. Things never change through time, really. They just sort of undergo appearances of change for Kant. Whereas Whitehead shifts to a serially ordered ontology, and therefore conception of personhood. For Kant, ontologically speaking, the self is a static thing that endures, unchanging through time, and time itself is ultimately unreal for Kant. For Whitehead, at least in our empirical observation, for Whitehead, each moment of the self's existence is, in effect, a new self, a sui generis, self-creative entity related to its personal antecedents and descendants, that is, its past and future instances of itself, by threads of shared character, with temporality understood as a fundamental element of reality as such. Whitehead's understanding of the metaphysically basic character of subjective freedom, that is, the expression of creativity in the formation of the actual occasion's subjective aim, that is, its goal for itself as it becomes, is substantive rather than merely formal. Indeed, creativity is, and Whitehead puts this in a discussion of Aristotle at the beginning of Process and Reality, creativity is the ontological substance of the becoming event. He puts this as in replacement of Aristotle's prima materia. For Whitehead agrees with Plato and Locke that to be an actual individual is to exercise power. There can be no merely passive or purely receptive actuality. And for Whitehead, this point further implies that to choose is to exert an influence on the character and constitution of one's environment. It is to do real work in the world, to reshape, in accordance with one's choice and in proportion to the efficacy of that choice, the conditions of reality as related to the context and scope of the choice at hand. Certainly, receptivity is involved in the process of choosing. The agent, the self, must choose from some given set of possible alternatives for it. And on Whitehead's account, these alternatives are prehended by the becoming subject as elements in the many, which are the received, what he calls superjective, environmental conditions that are presented to the emergent subject through the efficient causal efficacy of the past agents whose own choices have defined the environmental context of the concressing subject's alternatives for self-realization. But even this receptive aspect of the subject's becoming is not wholly passive, for the subject actively represents to itself this many as a function of its very subjectivity, which is emergent from, but definitively not identical to, the objectivity of its antecedent causal circumstances. So there's no determinism here for Whitehead, right? The changes that happen temporally are real. To be clear, this is not representation in the sense developed in the work of Descartes, Locke, and other pre-Kantian representationalists, who Kant takes to task in Critique of Pure Reason, but rather representation in the sense that one finds under the label of synthesis in Kant's treatment of the spontaneous unity of transcendental apperception in his great work, The Critique of Pure Reason. As a function, that is, this synthesis is a function of the activity of the faculty of understanding in the constitution of the individual's experience. And in an important sense, therefore, is the constitutive faculty of the individual's personhood as such. To have, or rather to be, a self, Kant tells us, is to actively synthesize, that is, to represent to oneself the data of one's experience. The data floods in, but you have to make it your own, right? You have to put your own perspective to it for it to be the data of your self, of your personal experience. The first thing to observe is that for Kant and Whitehead, this activity of synthesis or concrescence that constitutes the emerging unity of personal experience for the subject is, eo ipso, the intersection of ontological and epistemic conditions of selfhood at which personal freedom is located. For Kant, the transcendental synthesis effected by the understanding necessarily functions in accordance with the universal and deterministic laws of empirical advance, as he calls them. However, as a transcendental function of human subjectivity, this synthesis is also, by definition, an activity of the noumenal self, the soul, as the transcendental object grounding the possibility of subjectivity, which again, by definition, cannot be conceived of in terms of any dependence upon the laws that regulate merely apparent, that is, empirical, temporal objects. In other words, there's a bifurcation in Kant between the noumenal and the empirical self, and it's at this bifurcated point that personal freedom is introduced incoherently. Indeed, it seems to me that Kant is somewhat unreflectively developing the fundamental underpinnings for an ontology of serial-ordered selfhood. The problem, of course, is that he fails to perceive the full implications of this potentially epoch-making shift, and therefore attempts to graft it onto graft this revolutionary insight about the self-constructive character of each moment of subjectivity onto a traditional enduring substance conception of the noumenal self, and thus his system lapses into incoherence. So Kant gives us a serially ordered phenomenology with an enduring substance ontology, and it remained therefore for Whitehead to recognize and develop the full implications of Kant's insight in process and reality. Whitehead saw clearly that freedom, or more precisely creativity, as he terms it, must be immanent within rather than transcendent of the temporal order of subjective experience. This is why Whitehead's insistence on the substantive character of the act of creativity as constitutive of the actuality of the concrescent subject, as that which is required to manifest an abstract, determinate possibility for the self in the concrete superjective determination that it makes as it self-creates. That is why this is so crucial to the ultimate coherence of the account of creaturely freedom that Whitehead develops. And here I think lies the primary resource that Whitehead offers to contemporary theology, going back to the problems that were mentioned in the first panel. The incoherence of the notion of divine omnipotence and omnicausality as it's worked out in traditional Abrahamic monotheism, I think, is insoluble. And Whitehead saw that clearly, and he revised his understanding of God and of the self precisely in order to rescue the notion that the self is a free, independent locus of power related to God, but not deterministically ruled over by God as despot.
Well, first I want to say that George's comment, I think, strikes all of us with its truth, because no one who's been stirred by Whitehead's adventure in speculative philosophy can, in Whitehead's terminology, perceive these objective antecedent events without the form, the subjective form of lamentation. But I also will add, when we had the first conference on Whitehead in China in the 3rd millennium, I wrote a poem, Cosmology. And within that poem, there's a stanza: to wait for but a century, as Bach did. What is that to truth and beauty? So, let me begin on my remarks, please. I also want to thank Professor Leonard for his donation of this rare and historically significant letter from the great mathematician, mathematical logician, and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, to who his father, Henry S. Leonard, who had the unique privilege of serving as Whitehead's personal assistant during the period in which Whitehead's philosophy found its most mature and comprehensive expression, culminating in the magnus opus Process in Reality, and other signature works such as Adventures of Ideas. As Victor Lowe, Whitehead's biographer and Professor Leonard's senior classmate at Harvard, knew, it was to Henry to whom Whitehead would most openly and explicitly express his appraisal of the tendencies in philosophy which ran contrary to Whitehead's endeavors in speculative philosophy. Lowe sought to obtain this letter from Professor Richard Rudner, chairman of the philosophy department of Washington University, who for a time held the letter. And he also sought it from Priscilla Leonard, Professor Leonard's wife. While Priscilla could not put her hands on the letter, she recalled to Lowe that the charm and the wit with which Whitehead described contending schools of thought made Henry laugh whenever he reread the letter. The letter has a rare fusion of caustic tone and witty charm. This was so atypical of Whitehead, whose kind and gentle soul touched so many people, but it manifested the intensity of Whitehead's perception of the sterilizing consequences of those modes of thought which suppressed inquiry, wonder, and the spirit of adventure. Whitehead found in Henry S. Leonard, more than in any other eminent student in Cambridge, London, or Harvard, a kindred spirit who integrated a love of mathematical, logic, and metaphysics. It is worthy to note that Whitehead and Leonard served as presidents of the American Philosophical Association. Leonard is also regarded as father of the mathematical field of mereology through his work with Nelson Goodman on the calculus of individuals. That work represents a development of Whitehead's method of extensive abstraction in its study of the relation between wholes and parts and the relations of parts within wholes. During his tenure at Harvard, Leonard was Whitehead's student and then his personal assistant. Leonard was also a student and later a friend of the modal logician C.I. Lewis. At the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies, Leonard spent 2 years working with the Austrian mathematical logician Kurt Gödel. During that period, Leonard developed wide language W, which is a synthesis of propositional and modal logic, which provides the most accurate and deepest logical system for understanding the logic which underlies the axiomatic system within process and reality. Wide language W, more than Principia Mathematica itself, reflects the underlying logic to the ontology and cosmology of process and reality, in which the role of possibilities and potentialities play such a crucial role. Henry has given me the unpublished manuscript for Wide Language W, which manuscript I look forward to sharing with other scholars. After Leonard left the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies, I became his personal assistant, and at Washington University, Leonard presented this important work. While his presidential address touched on this, a further exposition and development of Wide Language W is part of Leonard's legacy that awaits its maturation. In Process and Reality, Whitehead devotes great attention to contrasting his philosophy of science and organism with the broad sweep of Western philosophical traditions, originating in the spectacular genius of Greek antiquity and running through British and continental philosophical traditions. He also cryptically remarks that the modes of thought of process and reality are more akin to ancient Eastern modes of thought and intuitions than they are to the atomism, mechanical materialism, and reductionism that had prevailed in Western philosophy and Western science for over 2.5 millennia. What Whitehead did not do is publicly address how his philosophy contrasted with the philosophical tendencies that were emerging concurrent with his own speculative philosophy. These tendencies would grip 20th century philosophy in a protracted period of what we may call anti-philosophy. 75 years ago, in response to the volume Philosophical Essays celebrating Whitehead's 75th birthday, Henry Leonard, along with other of Whitehead's eminent students at Harvard, composed a meticulously argued essay entitled Logical Positivism and Speculative Philosophy. It was Leonard's essay which elicited the 6-page letter from today, what is today formally domiciled in the magnificent Library of Congress. I believe Tim has obtained a copy of Philosophical Essays. In this letter, Whitehead writes, "Every mathematician and symbolic logician is, in his habit of thought, a logical positivist. Yet, to some of the expositions I find myself in violent opposition, especially to the very habit of dismissing questions as unmeaning, that is unable to be expressed in existing symbolism. Wittgenstein annoys me intensely. He is a complete example of the saying, I am master of this college. What I know not is not knowledge. Logical positivism in this mode, its early mode, will produce a timid, shut-in, unenterprising state of mind, engaged in the elaboration of details. I always test these general rules by trying to imagine their sterilizing effect of such a state of mind if perceived at any time, if prevalent at any time in the last 10,000 years. It's interesting because the Chinese think of units, yuan, of 10,000 years. The fact is that thought in the previous 2 centuries has been engaged in disengaging itself from the shackles of dogmatic divinity. Thus, it unconsciously seeks a new fetters, namely anything offensive to the Pope of Rome. But I see no reason to believe that the stretch of Bertrand Russell's mind, or of Wittgenstein's mind, or of Carnap's mind has attained the limits of insight or expression possible in the evolution of intelligent beings. They are bright boys, expressive of a stage of rationalism, but nothing more. 3 decades later, after receipt of the letter, Professor Leonard prepared formal comments which were to accompany the publication of this letter. Unfortunately, as his son indicated, he suddenly died during a trip to Germany, and the letter and his comments eluded, for all of these decades, the light of public recognition. Leonard revealed his change of perception of the relation of logical positivism and analytical philosophy to the traditional metaphysical task of philosophy. From Leonard, I quote, As I reread the essay today, I find myself tempted to say that there's practically nothing in it that I would change were I writing it today, except the whole thing. Finally, they, the positivists, saw philosophy as nothing more than analysis, an inquiry into the logic, the syntax of language of science, whereas I have seen then, and even to a greater extent now see, philosophy as an enterprise including speculative analysis, but as also including legitimate speculative inquiry, which incorporates both a critique of current scientific speculation and a venturing beyond them. Okay, Carolyn's encouraged me to finish. So let me just speak a minute or two extemporaneously. What Whitehead and Leonard came to see was that philosophy required an integration of synthetic and analytic modes of thought. Whitehead was one of the world's greatest analytic thinkers. If not, the precision and meaning of Principia Mathematica never would have emerged to shock the world of mathematics and to elicit the great German mathematician David Hilbert's comment that Principia is the greatest axiomatic system in the human history. And Whitehead deduced most of that. But the proclivity for precision of thought was not adequate from Whitehead's point of view. And logical positivism, in its rigidity, in its formality, the same as analytic philosophy, in its vacuity, when it's divorced from synthetic, integrating, and speculative modes of thought, and common language philosophy, in its utter banality, as expressed in Wittgenstein's work. Those three tendencies that grip 20th century philosophy so firmly, so relentlessly, those really would, if they prevailed, as they did, bring in the death of philosophy. Stephen Hawking in 2010 in his book Grand Design once again declares philosophy is dead. Whitehead's letter to Leonard really foreshadows that very fate, because philosophy is dead if it's divorced of wonder, intuition, adventures of ideas, etc. I have a larger formal essay on the background and significance of this letter. If people are interested in it, it's going to be published shortly, but I have a copy with me. I'd be glad to show it. And I try to illustrate the revolutionary implications of Whitehead's metaphysics to philosophy and to theoretical physics. And maybe this event today in the magnificent Library of Congress we can look upon as the resurrection of the great adventure that Whitehead's philosophy offers humanity.
Principia Mathematica is a continental divide in the Whitehead continent. On the one hand, it's a peak in the development of the philosophical language, a search that goes back to Ramon Lull and Bruno and Leibniz and the laws of thought of Boole. And on the other hand, it's not the wave of the future. If I criticize it, I'll try to be gentler than Whitehead would be. Whitehead was not only a philosopher of process, he was a philosopher in process. And first, some words about Principia. It begins with the most finite, basic experiences of abstraction. The typical page looks like a cross between the Cherokee syllabary and the Glagolithic alphabet. The dominant symbol is the horseshoe, which can appear either as a cup or a cap or on its side with various meanings. And the underlying algebra is not exactly that of Boole, it's rather what's called Boolean algebra. To it, Boolean algebra is a great bleacher. All propositions, all classes with the same number of elements are the same in Boolean algebra. The group is the permutation group on n things. It's sort of dull and constant. Complexity arises from the process of abstraction, which is represented in Principia primarily by the letter iota. If x is anything, iota x is the unit class whose only element is x. And by applying iota infinitely often, you get all the real numbers. First all the integers, and then from then on, the construction follows piano. In one sense, Principia satisfies, or was intended to satisfy the urge to have a language to which you could put in any question and get an answer in which you could be confident. A language which had a vocabulary rich enough to describe anything and a logic enabled to decide the important questions. In fact, however, the language of Principia is adequate only for the world of mathematics. Before Principia, I think there was some doubt about what mathematics was about. It seemed to be a world of many different countries which could hardly speak to each other. And now everybody knows mathematics is about set theory. And Principia made the transformation from a scattered to an integrated mathematics. The story isn't over. Modern category theorists are attempting to expand this notion, but always it turns out that it's just another version of set theory, written different. Of course, the story has a tragic ending. The book had hardly been published perhaps was in the process of publication, when Russell discovered that it was not self-consistent. You couldn't rely on it for any arguments. And you remember the Russell paradox of the non-self-containing set. Is it self-containing itself? And you can prove yes, and you can prove no. And the concept is completely within the rules of syntax of Principia. To deal with this, Russell proposed a theory of types. Von Neumann simplified the resolution considerably, and today Principia lives on in a couple of forms, but perhaps the greatest blow to the idea that one had a language that you could trust to decide any question is the result of Gödel, which flowed out of the paradox of Russell. Namely, the consistency of set theory is not a theorem of set theory. And it turns out that one can either add to set theory the statement that it's consistent or that it's inconsistent. Probably didn't say that exactly right, but my time is a little limited. I'm pretty sure that when Whitehead was doing Principia, he thought of it as a world of mathematics, but he also thought of the world of mathematics as imaging nature. He thought of himself as creating a language that could be used for physics. And indeed, all mathematical physics is expressed in the language of Principia if you push the rigor hard enough. But the actual direction that Whitehead thinking took was to doubt the adequacy of this particular system and any such system for describing nature. It's a loss of faith in language as a tool for the expression of propositions, is the way he put it. This comes up most strongly in his philosophy of organism, which is presented as a cell theory of nature. I don't think the argument for a cell theory of nature has been put as strongly, even by Whitehead, as it could be. I myself am personally quite convinced that that's the way we go. Consider how, for example, the atomic theory was discovered. It's true that Einstein got the Nobel Prize for his work on Brownian motion, which finally convinced most hard-nosed physicists that atoms exist, even though you couldn't touch them or see them. But in fact, chemists had taken for granted that there were atoms for centuries before Einstein. And they came to this conclusion just from the fact that you find the same chemicals everywhere. And they combine in certain fixed ways everywhere. The simplest way to handle this without invoking a lot of deities is to say they're all made of the same little particles, and their properties derive from those of the particles. So chemical atoms existed long before physical atoms, you could say, just in order to account for the remarkable uniformity of the properties of nature. Today we have changed physics into what is virtually a theory of the symmetry of nature. And at each point of the world, one finds a gauge group characterizing the symmetry of the immediate neighborhood of that point. And miracle of miracles, the gauge group is the same everywhere. Are all these points talking to each other? Is there some miracle going on? And again, the simplest way to understand this is to say that nature is cellular, and the gauge group tells you the symmetry or the dynamics of the individual cell. So I simply have no doubt that the practical road for physical research today is in the direction of cellularity. And this is not my conclusion, especially there's a long line of physicists following this road, but because it's a difficult and rather branching one. We haven't gotten very far, and one doesn't expect a physicist who has to earn his living at physics to undertake this particular adventure. If you look in the process of reality, it's pretty clear that Whitehead takes as the basic process of nature concrescence, in which two or several things die and their concrescence is born, is the way he puts it. And this is a pretty description of the iota of Principia. And I must say that for an unpleasant number of decades, I pushed the idea that the passage of time was represented by a quantum version of iota. And I think that's a deep mistake. Iota is deeply irreversible. It doesn't have an inverse. The empty set is not the iota of anything. There is no reason to doubt that at the microscopic level, nature is reversible. The cause and effect irreversibility that we see in the large is very likely a matter of thermodynamic irreversibility, a matter of there being too many variables for our mere mortal tools to control. We can't put the steam back into the teapot just by turning off the heat. So, while I think with Whitehead that this process of abstraction is a fundamental one, it ain't the passage of time. On the contrary, the passage of time is one of the basic symmetries and is dealt with in quantum theory today by the standard methods of group theory used for any other translation or rotation. The catch being that when you put many elementary systems together, an irreversibility arises out of complexity. A complexity which you can't build just with the Boolean algebra that was the main language before Principia Mathematica. You can say, when Heisenberg described the quantum theory in the earlier years, he said, quantum theory is non-objective physics. I guess he didn't have the word processual, so he had to put it in a negative way. But it's true that quantum theories deals with operations, and the main difference between them and the propositions of Boole is they don't commute. And it's handy to represent them, if you like, by matrices, as Heisenberg did. But in fact, another way to express what replaces Boole in quantum theory is projective geometry. We meet Whitehead again. I'm not sure that Whitehead ever had enough confidence in projective geometry to suggest it as the next language after Principia. I think that's the way things are going, though, and that's the language of quantum theory today, although I think most physicists don't take courses in projective geometry. Dirac did, and it profoundly influenced his pioneering work in quantum theory, as he describes in his own biographical and autobiographical material. Let me just close by saying that every few years I go back and reread Whitehead, mostly a result of some gentle stimulation by Timothy Eastman. And I discover that Whitehead is one of those fortunate individuals who doesn't let the mere accident of death interfere with his intellectual development. Each time I go back to him, I find him considerably wiser than the previous time. Thank you.
Hi. Well, David, that was great. Thanks so much for introducing physics. It's going to make my job a little bit easier because it's difficult to talk about something as complex as Whitehead and something as complex as modern physics in a very short period of time without either frightening all of you away, frightening myself away. If I do run away, don't take it personally. It's just doing my best. But actually, the thing about Whitehead and the thing about modern physics for me is that, yes, it's complex, but it's deeply intuitive, I think. I find quantum theory to be deeply intuitive in the same way that I find Whiteheadian cosmology and metaphysics to be deeply intuitive. And so, if I'm right, after 10 minutes, I think everyone should be happy. I'm hoping that I'll at least be able to communicate something that's coherent in 10 minutes. And what I'd like to do, actually, is start with just by reading a quick section of Dr. Leonard's letter. This is actually the last paragraph, where Whitehead says, "What I do object to is, one, the reduction of all possibilities of symbolism to the scanty productions of mankind so far, and two, the notion that no pattern can be directly discerned unless it is symbolized. Of course, symbolism enormously facilitates the discernment of the pattern, for we thereby discern the pattern in alternative exemplifications. In fact, the curse of the history of human thought is overstatement." And with respect to physics, I think what he would say about classical physics is that it's a perfect example of such an overstatement. Because in classical physics, the idea is that you can provide through measurement, ideally, a complete specification of the system that you're measuring. And by specification, I mean a specification in terms of some pattern, some logical, mathematical pattern that's represented symbolically. That's what science does. And classical physics, by its belief, its presupposition that a complete specification is possible, would be an example of an overstatement in that regard. And I would say that with respect to modern physics, quantum theory, the brute fact is that a complete specification, in that sense, it's impossible. And the reason it's impossible is because in quantum theory, a measurement interaction, for the most part, is, I think, most fundamentally expressible as a schematization or a system of relations between the detector system and the object system. And it's an integration of those relations. And so by bringing the subject system, the detector, in connection with the system that's being measured, it's difficult, it's difficult to maintain the definition of objectivity in that sense. And Bohr was famous for admonishing us that there is no sharp separation between the device you're using to measure a system and the system that you're measuring. The impossibility of sharp separation is what he says. So that's a difficulty. That means that, to bring this back to your discussion of the Principia, in essence, this means that any measurement of a system, any predication of the system, because you can't divorce the subject from the object, any measurement is essentially self-predicative. It's a self-predication, which produces all kinds of paradoxes if you believe that that type of predication gives you a complete picture. So that's one problem. The other problem is the fact that if you universalize quantum theory, if you look at it as an ontologically significant way of looking at nature, it's not only impossible to separate the object system from the subject apparatus, the device, it's also impossible to separate the rest of the universe from the system and the device together. The entanglement isn't just between the measuring apparatus and the system, but the entanglement is between all of that and the rest of the world. And this can be physically expressed in the sense of environmental relations between facts of the world that are in thermodynamic contact, let's say, with the system and the apparatus. And no matter how much you try to isolate the system, you're never going to be able to completely isolate the system. So that means that it's not just a self-predicative measurement that happens in quantum theory where you can't get rid of the subject. You also can't get rid of the rest of the world either. And in that sense, and that's the other problem in the Principia, you don't just run into trouble when you do self-predication, you run into trouble whenever you try to predicate a totality. You run into all kinds of problems. So the key in quantum theory is to answer the question, how do I isolate or how do I refine my scheme, the pattern that I'm trying to depict when I make a measurement? How do I isolate that pattern from the rest of the world? How do I focus on just the relations between the system and the detector, and in abstraction from all of the other relations between the system and the environment, the detector and the environment? How do I do that? Because, well, you have to do it just in order to do the calculations. I mean, there's no possible way to follow all of these relations together. The other problem is that, and those of you who are familiar with the Schrödinger cat, it's not really a paradox, but it's an interesting thought experiment where you have the sum total of all of these relations being something akin to saying at the same time the cat is alive and the cat is dead. When you try to integrate relations quantum mechanically that way, you're left with these types of statements which defy the logical principle of non-contradiction. In that sense, cannot really be said to be logically coherent because that principle of non-contradiction is violated. So you don't want a statement, the cat is alive and dead at the same time. So how do you refine those relations that are the result of a quantum mechanical measurement? How do you refine them so that they yield logically coherent statements such as the cat is alive or dead, which is what you want, and which luckily that's what you get at the end of a quantum mechanical measurement? Well, how? I think that Whitehead was onto something with respect to the idea that there are aspects of a symbolic representation of a system that are ignored for a reason. You actually get mileage out of the fact that there are unknowns, and that both known unknowns and unknown unknowns. Sorry to evoke Donald Rumsfeld here, but you know, I get what he was saying. The fact that if you incorporate that into your symbolic representation of a physical system, you will wind up with a logically coherent set of probability outcomes that work. And so before I get into how that works in physics, I want to read another quick section from this letter. This is actually from the first page, the last paragraph there. And here he's commenting on Dr. Leonard's take, and he's agreeing with him in the sense. He says, you take the line, in effect, that order, quote unquote, means a pattern of qualities with a cumulative effect, namely the one composite satisfaction derived from those, quote, things in that pattern, underlined that, and also the rationalization means the discernment of the pattern which dominates the effect. So those things in that pattern, and in quantum physics what we're doing there is saying I want to specify the state of these particular things, the system I'm measuring, and I'm going to predicate that by referring to those things in terms of a particular pattern in divorce from all the rest. Well, in quantum theory, to make a long story short, no one really knows how it is that this crazy integration of mostly illogical relations between a system and an environment and a detector gets distilled into a very logical matrix of probable outcomes that make sense. We don't know how that works or that it actually works. We just know that's what you end up with when you do a measurement. In the past couple of decades, there has been an attempt to answer that question by saying that when you bring into the formalism all of those relations that you previously thought were unimportant, all those environmental relations, when you integrate them into the scheme without specifying them, you're not following them, you're just integrating their existence into the scheme, what you end up with, mathematically, is a nice reduction of this crazy integration of probable outcomes to a nice, coherent, logical collection, a menu, a matrix of probable outcomes that do satisfy the principle of non-contradiction. They also satisfy the principle of the excluded middle, which means one of them will happen, which is also a benefit because it's the other problem. Quantum theory can't account for why there's a fact at the end of a measurement. And what Whitehead, I think, would say is, well, it's presupposed because you're dealing with a collection of possible outcomes. Each has a probability valuation, meaning all of them together must sum to unity, which you could interpret philosophically as meaning that, well, one of them will happen. And they're mutually exclusive, so they don't interfere. There are no live dead cat superpositions. There's simply the probability of a live cat and the probability of a dead cat. And so we call this decoherence. This is what happens when a coherent superposition of potentia are integrated into a logically coherent, I shouldn't say coherent here because it sort of defeats the purpose of using it in two different ways, but let's say a logically consistent matrix of probable outcomes. And that's referred to as a decoherence. What drives decoherence? There's different theories about it, but one type of decoherence, environmental decoherence, is driven by just what I've been talking about, bringing in these relationships between the system, the detector, and the environment, bringing them into the specification, into the scheme, without specifying them. So I suppose I can close by simply saying that in a nutshell, what this means is that though in classical physics and in probably early quantum physics, where all of those extraneous relations were thought to be unimportant, we just simply ignore them. They're not important to the particular thing I'm measuring right now. A Whiteheadian sort of outlook on that would repudiate that belief. I think Whitehead would say, well, they may be unimportant to that particular scheme that you're developing. They may be unimportant to that particular measurement that you're trying to develop, but they're not unimportant to the formation of that measurement, the formation of that scheme. The formation of that scheme depends upon all of those, well, what Whitehead would call them diversities of detail. And yes, you negatively select those because they're unimportant to the particular measurement that you're making. But his point it would be that you can't have a logically coherent measurement in the first place without integrating those, without specifying them, but without integrating those extraneous relations. So the unknown, whether it's a known unknown or an unknown unknown, it's important to physics. And I think it captures the essence of what he was saying with respect to where positivism would lead us. Ultimately, it would lead us to a dead end. It's important, these things that we don't follow, because everything in quantum mechanics, I mean, essentially, any particular measurement, if you universalize quantum theory, any measurement of a particular system is a measurement of the universe itself. And this, both the known features of the universe and the unknown features. And I think that captures the essence of what Whitehead had in mind, probably, if he had thought about his cosmology actually informing physics as it progressed. I think he would have something like that in mind, very basically anyway. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks very much.
I am currently a physicist, a space scientist working at NASA Goddard, and when I first got into my current career, I was thinking about going into philosophy, and my philosophy teacher, Herbert Feigl, who was one of the members of the Vienna Circle of Logical Positivism, very good lecturer and teacher, he advised me if I really want to do philosophy, I should first complete my physics degree and do that and then come back to philosophy. Well, I never got back to philosophy, but I enjoy sort of doing some philosophy, so to speak, on the side, which led in one case to this edited volume on physics and Whitehead that I worked on, and this came out from SUNY Press in 2004, and also context with all the wonderful presenters that have been here. And hearing the various presentations of the symposium makes me recall the time when I had just finished my quantum physics courses and electromagnetism and relativity, and right after getting my undergraduate degree and having initial exposure to these concepts after having been growing up on the farm, but here's all these various esoteric kinds of things, having a lot of struggles with what does field theory mean? What does it, these abstract concepts about electromagnetism and so forth, what do they mean? Well, my professor said, well, one way to approach this is learn, obey, compute. You know, that's often for those in the quantum physics course when you don't know, well, what does it really mean? And so I was learning and obeying and computing, but not yet understanding. And so then that summer, after this spring semester, I read, obtained a copy of Process and Reality by Whitehead, and for whatever reason, I just got buried into it and sort of into that mode of thinking. And I had been living in this world of perceptual objects, this ordinary world, and thinking of that, and just not being able to integrate this notion about what field theory and these new physical concepts are. I was reading Process and Reality and then getting myself immersed in Whitehead's discussion, and then I just had an aha experience. You know, it just all came together for me. And it was emotional, you know. And then I began to see ways in which these different ideas were almost like a generator of ideas. It wasn't just a particular conceptual system. Here was a particular methodology, a way of thinking about the very way of being in the world and asking questions. And so it just sort of, in a way, transformed how I thought about who I was and the nature of the world. And so so then I was launched into, so to speak, my own particular adventure of ideas, however limited it was. And so that, so to speak, led to me thinking about my own specialty of space plasma physics in different ways, of how electromagnetism and plasmas are an integral part of the whole astrophysical systems. And so you have not just gravity being significant in contemporary studies of astrophysical systems. It's a combination of gravity and electromagnetism, and this combination leads to a whole bunch of processes that we're just really beginning to understand by the sets of observations that my fellow scientists at NASA Goddard are really involved in a great, new discoveries and explorations that you read about. But I would say that they are not tied up in the kind of abstractions and being constrained and confined by that. They're right now in this kind of mode of, great discovery period, and they're just not, they're too busy in that to be caught up in, so to speak, the logical or other kinds of straitjackets that Whitehead spoke out against in his 1936 letter, that Whitehead called attention to, whether it be in philosophical thought or scientific thought. We need to constantly be breaking out of whatever bounds we create for ourselves or others appear to create for us, to have confidence in your own immediate experience in the world as an individual, have confidence in your encounter with others, and from that, that experience to identify possible abstractions and relevant, say, formalisms, even mathematical ones that can give suggestions, insights to hypotheses that then can help order that experience so that one can then find new ways of finding order amidst the disorder, of applying, so to speak, the scientific kind of methodology of hypothesis and testing and falsification and identifying, new understanding, but then going on to the next step, but doing this in philosophy and doing that kind of methodology in one's daily life. And so let me just briefly indicate a little bit of history of Whitehead that got him potentially into his notion of prehension and applying some of that those concepts in his work in the 1920s, and some of that backdrop, because I think it's an important backdrop. Now, Whitehead himself was a mathematical physicist. He's sometimes described as a, logician, mathematician, philosopher, but in our current parlance, at least in part, he was a mathematical physicist. And of course, he was at the same time was as well these other things. Yeah, and in the traditions of mathematical physics from the 19th century, there was just a tremendous sequence of breakthroughs. of Faraday and Maxwell with respect to electromagnetism and the incipient development of field theory then, and Whitehead was greatly impressed by the success of Faraday and Maxwell's models of electric and magnetic phenomena, in particular, as stated by Professor Ronnie Desmet of the Free University of Brussels. Whitehead was especially struck by the fact that Hamilton's formal generalization of complex numbers into quaternions ultimately gave rise to a vector calculus that led Maxwell and his followers to the descriptive unification of electricity and magnetism. In turn, the foundation of modern field theories, cornerstones of modern physics, as described by Professor Finkelstein. These successes encouraged Whitehead in his successive involvements, quoting Desmet, with, quote, Grossman's algebra of extensions in universal algebra, that's his great work of the 1890s, his involvement with Russell's logic for relations in Principia Mathematica, now the 100th anniversary of that great work, and his involvement with Einstein's theories of relativity in the Principles of Relativity, 1922, as successive expressions of his urge to unify all branches of mathematics and physics. In a way, his own struggle with trying to get at a unified theory of all of these. His generalizations of patterns of relation, you might say that's what mathematics is about, going even on to a generalized mathematics, led him further to discover, quote, quoting Desmet, abstract patterns in terms of which all concrete elements of our experience can be unified, going from even the abstract mathematics right to the immediacy of human experience. What's structurally commonalities could be of all that? A procedure at the core of Whitehead's methodology of speculative philosophy. Indeed, philosopher James Bradley of the University of Newfoundland argues that, quote, in Process and Reality and in subsequent writings, Whitehead builds on the brilliant success of the Frege-Russell generalization of the mathematical function and develops his philosophy on that basis. So there's a way in which he then methodologically is utilizing a particular way of thinking about the mathematical function, and the mapping activity, mapping procedure done in mathematics at a very fundamental level, to a way of thinking about how to generate new hypotheses and new conceptual notions that then ultimately can help us with understanding questions, very philosophical questions about human experience and other things, not just abstract mathematical objects. And a prime example of this methodology of speculative philosophy, with its unique roots in the new field theory and its generalized mathematics, is the concept of prehension, previously mentioned, which is developed in part as a philosophical generalization of physical interactions in field theory. Now, this all may seem rather abstract, but then it came back to me in a new way just reading this past week a most interesting book by Brian Henning, that was mentioned by George Lucas, whose new book, Ethics of Creativity, lays out a whole new way of approaching questions of ethics, a really fundamental new approach to ethics. That's not just simply virtue ethic or deontological ethics or utilitarian, but incorporates within it an approach that utilizes the notion of creativity that was elaborated by our main presenter, Professor Faber, and also Frederick Frey has been working with this on his book, Being and Value. But this connects to, he discusses how this connects to Leopold's land ethic and to new work by Wes Jackson, who does work in agriculture. And this comes back for myself to new ways of connecting my background of growing up on a farm, connecting to these abstract notions in mathematical physics and my own experience when working with physical systems in space science, to a new approach to ethics. And these seem like unexpected connections. And yet this is the very nature of Whitehead and what's been generated by his work and the International Process Network and the Center for Process Studies. Indeed, this is reflected in a recent book, the Handbook of Whiteheadian Process Thought. There's 2 volumes edited by Weber and Henning, 1,400 pages, 17 major areas, 64 essays by leading process thinkers worldwide, And it's just covered every area you can imagine of people who have been similarly inspired to connect these otherwise disparate areas in new, interesting ways in an adventure of ideas, an adventure of discovery, to which I wish to thank, well, I so much to thank Whitehead for, but of course my colleagues here that I am in constant dialogue with. Thank you very much.
I didn't really think it was possible to keep so many brilliant minds and energetic thinkers roped into close to 10 minutes each. But we have succeeded, and that means we do have time for questions and discussion. And this will include both people on the dais, but also those of you in the audience, et cetera. So the floor is open. Yeah, that's good.
Question for Dr. Finkelstein. In your discussion of Principia, you mentioned the iota, positive only, but not a symmetric negative on it. You also talked about category theory for a while. In category theory, and I'm wondering whether or not there's a relationship between these two. You have a zero element, an initial element, and a terminal element. And any category also gives rise to the construction of a symmetric algebraic system, one of the constructions. My question is whether or not the elements zero, initial, terminal, and symmetry, as brought about by limits and co-limits, whether or not those would give you a hint that category theory might be suitable as a basis for mathematics.
First of all, I'm really not a mathematician.
Well, but you...
But I respect mathematicians greatly.
Sure.
And many great ones think that category algebra is a reasonable way to express the ontology of mathematics, the nature of mathematical being, and they're doing it. It seems to work. Lawvier is perhaps most well known.
Can I just add?
Of course, the original discoverers of the concept of category algebra in connection. Okay.
Just an answer to your question, too. With respect to the application of category theory to Whitehead, and particularly his method of extensive abstraction, Tim and I are actually involved in a research group where we're doing that very thing. There's a theorist at the University of Athens named Elias Zefiris, who is applying category theory and sheaf theory to Whiteheadian metaphysics and its application to physics. And so that's something that we're actively working on right now.
Quite know how to formulate a question.
You can go, actually, we have the Center for Philosophy and the Natural Sciences. It's at Cal State University, Sacramento, where I teach. It's, if you just go to www.csus.edu and then /CPNS, you can see basically a white paper that we have posted up there that addresses the questions you asked. Sure.
Could I just add one thing? Namely, category algebra is designed to study classical objects. So, for example, there's a category of quantum theories, which are classical objects. But if you look at a quantum system, its algebra is not a category algebra. It violates the axiom of enough identities. In a quantum system, there's only one identity. And it ain't enough.
Thanks
and that's
a
a very basic fact of quantum theory.
Thank you.
I wanted to thank all the speakers for accumulating so much for us to take in and try to integrate in the manner of an actual entity in Whitehead's system, or in the manner of any of the speakers who have basically done the same thing in the course of getting here to give this talk. So I just want to pick up one element in there, well, so many, but the fact that consistency couldn't be captured in the Principia Mathematica as a sign of its failure to Whitehead himself, that seems to me to be a peculiar moment, because in a way you could turn that around and say the fact that it proved that consistency couldn't be captured in a mathematical or a symbolic system is the sign of its sort of triumph. It really expressed that completely, as Gödel did too, I guess. But in a sense, that's a positive sign of really knowing articulately the limits of expression, whether it's mathematical or scientific. And there's something in that. I think it kind of connects with the last statement about category theory as well, its failure to apply to a quantum system. In a sense, any system that really achieves a unification of its environment in the manner that you just spoke, and in the manner of any measurement in a quantum system, is sort of I don't know how to finish that thought, but basically it does that. It achieves that sort of by becoming a measurement, or by becoming a unified moment, and it does that sort of by violating a number of, certainly by violating consistency. And I think that's because time moves on, and every next moment sort of requires it be done again.
I just want to say, just to answer that, Whitehead's cosmology, there is consistency. And you only get into trouble when you're talking about the totality or the universe. If you look at the universe as a process, where you're not dealing with the totality, but a totality that's internally related to an antecedent totality. Put another way, every new fact incorporates a new universe. With every new fact, with every novel fact, a novel universe. Then you can recapture consistency. So it's only when you're dealing with a when you're dealing with sort of a block universe totality that you run into trouble. And that was one of the wonderful things. If you read the Principia and then you read Process and Reality, you see an evolution of thought, I think, in that regard.
And another way to express that way of avoiding the trouble that has often happened in conventional thinking is to not, and for Whitehead and this approach, one distinguishes two aspects of the real, a possibility and actuality. As Jeff Boob described it in one of his works in quantum physics and interpretation, a distinction between possibility space, which may be like your logical order you've introduced, and actuality space, which associates with the causal order. By making these distinctions and not simply conflating all of the real as actualized, and so to speak, then forcing yourself into a block universe by virtue of your philosophical presupposition, which then basically is embedded in claims by, say, certain physicists that it's an absolute deterministic universe. Those claims have an implicit mathematical proposition in it that is unstated. So by simply making this distinction, which is clear in Whitehead, this is, I think, very helpful. And
I just wanted to say, I mean, this issue of totality has been a significant one in process. I think it's one of the reasons for the split between Hartshorne and Whitehead. It certainly is something that Whitehead has been criticized in terms of implying a notion of a totality, a systematic notion of a totality. I have an article coming out, a correspondence at the APA a few years ago between another process thinker, George Shields, and I, is leading to a focus section in process studies that should be coming out soon if you're interested in this. And we get into this issue a bit, and I'm no mathematician, but if I can hopefully not too violently reduce this issue in terms of the way it works, sometimes this is termed the problem of big omega, right? And the idea is, as Tim put it, that each if there is a totality that is the sort of uber set, right, then its relation to its contents becomes another set ad infinitum. There's a sort of infinite regress problem. I'm more and more convinced, and I think this would not be a distinction in the logic between sets and categories. I think this would work with either. That this problem is not really a problem, that it's the result of a mistaken application of the concept of a set or a category. A set or a category is something that distinguishes one thing from another. It groups and therefore excludes. But a totality has no exclusion. A totality, if there is one, and I think, like Whitehead, that the proper understanding of the totality is the holistic conception of God, the primordial, and the consequent natures of God together, including, in my mind, the full range of eternal objects as robustly platonically formulated by Whitehead. That represents an ontological whole that cannot be distinguished from anything. It's not a set. And so it seems to me that Whitehead liked to say, right, that, well, actually I should say, Hartshorne said of Whitehead that he may have been led astray by his mathematical thinking, right, in terms of developing this notion of the eternal object. I think quite the contrary, Whitehead may have perceived underneath the mathematical theory a conceptual distinction that was not being made explicit elsewhere, that between sets or categories and the totality. So I think we're moving towards a solution of that problem implicitly, at least in Whiteheadian theory. So.
Another, yeah.
There's a question for Professor Lucas.
There he is.
You made a passing reference to William James, and I want some elaboration on the relationship of Whitehead and James thought, because I think this might have some potential for overcoming the lament if this can be recovered in contemporary times. I think there's some richness there. I'd just like to have you say something more about that relationship with William James thought.
There are a number of ways of, There are a number of ways of going about that, and I'm probably not the best person to take it on since I'm not really a James scholar. One is to what extent Whitehead himself paid any attention to William James, was influenced by him. He acknowledges him with great respect and politeness in several of his works, but doesn't, to my knowledge, appear to have made any great study of James' thought, though those who have made studies of both see a great deal of similarity between their conceptions of, especially ontological conceptions of the world, that what I referred to in passing of Russell's critique of James and later appropriation of James' neutral monism can be interpreted in a way, Jamesian scholars will, that looks very much like the ontology of actual occasions. So that's one way of going about it. A second way would be in terms of the comments I made about the sort of decline or marginalization of Whitehead's influence. James, by contrast, has not been entirely given up on, in the sense that there are departments of philosophy in this country with really eminent scholars in a number of parts of the nation who continue to study James. There's a collected James edition. The works are preserved for posterity. I myself had some role, very modest role, in helping to fund those projects, the editions, the James edition, when I was at the National Endowment for the Humanities. How would one put this? That in those departments, were a student interested in exploring the affinities of Whitehead and James, they would find a sympathetic audience. If they wanted to argue that the Whitehead from 1923-24 on, the work of the American period belonged in the American canon in the same way that the works of James and Dewey belong in the American canon. I think that's actually the case that Roland, myself, and others are trying to make with regard to Whitehead now, that if we did an edition of James's works, why are we not doing one of Whitehead's? If we did an edition of Dewey's works and are now contemplating an edition of Josiah Royce's works and of C.S. Peirce's works, why are we not doing one of Whitehead? So it's in a sense a matter of cultural patrimony and fairness. So that's an entirely different approach, a sort of cultural approach to the resurrection, if you will, of Whitehead, not only through his intellectual affinities with and his historical influence and respect for James, but also as part of that American conversation, which is, I suspect, what you're referring to, that would provide a more hospitable context, and has actually in the Society for the SAP, the Society for Advancement of American Philosophy, has always been very open to Whitehead. It's just that there haven't been that many Whiteheadians that are part of that society. So there's a place there. My suspicion is, this answer is going on too long, but the problem is that a person who is caught between two cultures is in danger of being appropriated by neither. So, and this was Wittgenstein's problem as well, of course, and that didn't happen to him. He was an Austrian and an engineer and a mathematician. On the other hand, he was a philosopher in his English language avatar incarnation. And both Wittgensteins are deeply appreciated by both cultures. Why can't the same be true of Whitehead? But it is the case that right now, not only is that not happening, but it's not clear which culture, the British or the American, ought to step forward and put the money out to do the work, to fund the departments, to fund the editions, to fund the scholarship. Each looks to the other and says, well, he's your guy. You know, if the British aren't interested, why should we be? Well, the funders will say, we'll probably hear something like that in response to our grant proposal for the edition. Well, he's really not our guy. Why should we pay for this? I mean, it gets down to something like that. So there are avenues, intellectual, historical, cultural, archival, in which this could be done, but they're all fraught with a certain degree of difficulty.
One more question, Ron?
Thank you. I'd like to make a few comments about the questions of ontology and logic. Professor Leonard always emphasized that Whitehead's philosophy, to be true to itself, must be in a continuous process of creative development, creative application, and creative modification. And the development also is because it's an axiomatic system processed in reality. So the implications are infinite, and Whitehead understood that. What is not recognized as clearly as it should be is that Whitehead's philosophy itself evolved. The ontology of Principia Mathematica looked upon mathematical entities as classes of classes. By the time process in reality was created, there was a subtle but real shift in Whitehead's thought, where rather than classes of classes, it's attributes, eternal objects, and attributes of attributes and relations of relationships that became important. And that distinction is not clearly understood. Even his treatment of geometry, I contend, became more rooted in eternal objects. That is, space wasn't created, but space is a totality of spatial magnitudes and spatial relationships. Change doesn't create space, but change presupposes space. So Whitehead's treatment of space took on a very different ontology in process and reality. And it's that ontology that contrasts with Einstein's general theory of relativity and also the work of string theorists like Brian Greene and Lind and Gutt, who speak about space as being created, warped, bending, etc. It's groups of entities that change, contort, not space as a totality of potential relations. The other thing, in terms of the ontology, the logic of Principia Mathematica is a propositional, truth functional logic. The logic, as I tried to argue a little bit in my talk and in my paper, a process in reality is much more a modal logic. Possibilities as pure possibilities represent not truths, but possible modes of being. In contrast, potentialities are actual facts. That is, events have within them multiple causal potentialities, which are realized and which are frustrated as a function of environment. And as Mike said, that environment extends beyond and beyond, and change in the Taoist way that Carolyn references is always an interaction of internal reality with external reality. That's very profoundly Whiteheadian. So the logic in process and reality is really a modal logic. And Professor Leonard was blessed to be a student of the greatest propositional logician, Whitehead. And Whitehead is the one who did most of the deductions of Principia Mathematica, not Russell. And also of the great modal logician C.I. Lewis. So there is in process and reality, a shift in the development, a creative development of the underlying logic. Unfortunately, Whitehead never articulated that logic. He utilized the logic of potentiality. And potentialities became a part of actuality. They didn't exist in a Platonic realm of pure abstract possibilities. They are part of the living soul of the actual world, of events as they evolved and developed. So I think we have to look at Whitehead's own work as not only calling for its development, its application, exploration of its implication, an adventure, but we have to see it as manifesting an evolution in Whitehead's own ontological concepts. And I will make available for those who are interested Professor Leonard's Wide Language W, which is very magnificent work. It's his magnus opus. But it's very important that we have a synthesis of propositional and modal logic, because process and reality cannot be understood. And cosmology and ontology cannot be understood, if Whitehead is correct, without an underlying logic that goes beyond the logic and its ontology of Principia.
I think Ron has had the last word. We are 5 minutes over time, which to my mind is just on time. I want to thank all of our many speakers this morning for the magnificent job of clear articulation of something that is so complex, for coming and spending the time with us. I also want to thank all of the audience who were here, all of the library specialists who made it possible to come together and pull this off, and thank you. May the conversation continue informally.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.